actually training.
Maybe. You know what? I should get his others.
Yes.
Nice of you to schedule this.
We were scheduled first.
What's the deal with Homeland Security getting arrested? I know that he is in the building, but I have not seen him. No, sir.
Does he usually come straight here or coming back in?
It depends on what time he shows up. Probably will sit in the back for a little bit.
Test 1, 2, 3. Sound check. Court reporter.
I will. I'll wave if we find him. Yeah. A few minutes ago.
One, two, testing, 1, 2, 3.
Chairman.
How are you?
Great to see you.
Are you ready to go?
Yes, sir. All set.
Good morning. The Judiciary Committee will come to order, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everyone to this morning's hearing on the oversight of the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. Welcome, Director Comey, to your second appearance before the House Judiciary Committee since your confirmation as the 7th Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are happy to have you here with us today. I once again commend your distinguished service to our nation, and I'm confident you will continue to serve honorably at the helm of the FBI. Today, the FBI continues to face the effects of one of the worst national security leaks in our nation's history by Edward Snowden 2 years ago. Over the past year, the House Judiciary Committee spearheaded passage of the USA Freedom Act, a bipartisan law that ended a controversial national security program and provided expanded oversight and transparency of America's intelligence gathering. The USA Freedom Act ensures that federal law appropriately respects civil liberties while providing the necessary tools to preserve our collection capabilities and thereby meet our national security responsibilities. I want to again thank Director Comey and the men and women of the FBI for working closely with members of this committee to ensure passage and enactment of the USA Freedom Act. Events over the past year in the Middle East have deeply violated the world's moral compass with scenes of unimaginable brutality at the hands of ISIS. In particular, the appalling and indiscriminate targeting of anyone who fails to abide by ISIS' stated goal to establish a global caliphate has resulted in the shedding of innocent blood by the most revolting methods. As a radical Islamic terrorist organization, ISIS mandates conformity to an ideology which permits no dissent. As Americans with a strong history of protecting religious liberty, we stand in total opposition to ISIS' decimation of Christian populations in the Middle East and to its vicious tactics. America is not immune to ISIS propaganda of terror. American teenagers have been radicalized in part by ISIS' concerted social media efforts promoting the killing of fellow Americans. And just last week, a like-minded cyber hacker was indicted for providing ISIS with information on U.S. service members. Director Comey, you are at the forefront of protecting our country from those who patiently plot to do us harm. And I'm interested today in hearing more about the FBI's efforts to combat ISIS. Over 3 years ago, our diplomatic mission to Benghazi, Libya, was attacked by terrorists, and 4 Americans, including our ambassador, were killed. As of today, only 1 subject has been apprehended and placed on trial. I am interested in hearing more from you about the status of the FBI's investigation and efforts to bring to justice other terrorist killers who murdered 4 of our citizens. Separately, it was revealed this past year that former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton used a private email server to conduct her official business while serving as Secretary of State. 2 inspectors general have already reported that classified information was contained within Secretary Clinton's private email and have referred the matter to the Justice Department. While the apparent lack of transparency related to the use of a private server to conduct the nation's diplomatic business is troubling, it also raises significant questions concerning the security of national secrets and the potential insight that such a home brew setup may afford a foreign intelligence service into the day-to-day digital record of a top-level government official. On the technology front, the issue known as going dark has been at the top of the FBI's concerns in recent years. Encryption technology is exciting and can effectively secure private communications when privacy is needed or desired. In fact, over 15 years ago, I led congressional efforts to ensure strong encryption technologies and to ensure that the government could not automatically demand a backdoor key to encryption technologies. This enabled the U.S. encryption market to thrive and produce legitimate encryption technologies for legitimate actors rather than see the market head completely overseas to companies that do not have to comply with basic protections. However, it is true that this technology can also be used by those who wish to do us harm. Adoption of new communications technologies by those intending to harm the American people is outpacing law enforcement's technological capability to access those communications in legitimate criminal and terrorist investigations. In light of the administration's recent announcement that it is not currently seeking a legislative solution to its going dark challenges, I am interested to hear your perspective on whether the administration's newly announced approach to work in an ad hoc fashion with communications providers is an adequate solution. Finally, violent crime appears to be on the rise across the country, particularly around our major metropolitan centers. It is disconcerting to watch the gains of the past decades unravel in an explosion of community violence. We have also witnessed several incidents in the past year that unfortunately have led to increased community tension with law enforcement. This tension will hopefully be resolved through improved communication, accountability, policing practices, and various other initiatives. I hope to hear the FBI's perspectives on the reasons for the increase in crime and how to ensure that law enforcement officers and the citizens they serve can coexist in a safe and respectful environment. In conclusion, Mr. Director, please know that this committee sincerely appreciates your efforts to keep us safe and the heroic actions consistently performed by the men and women of the FBI to protect our country. I look forward to hearing your answers on all of these important topics today, as well as on our other issues of significance to the FBI and our nation. At this time, I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Goodlatte. Good morning, Director Comey. We welcome you for this second appearance before the House Judiciary Committee since taking office on September the 4th, 2013. The FBI's mission is a complex undertaking to protect the United States from terrorism, to enforce our criminal laws, and to lead the nation's law enforcement community. And yet, as vast as this mission seems, I think nearly all of the discussion we will have here today can be distilled into one word: trust. Trust in the executive branch to respect and secure our privacy and our civil liberties. Trust in the FBI as an institution. Trust in state and local agencies that police our communities. In many respects, Director Comey, I think we agree on this point. For example, you have spoken powerfully about the hard truths we must keep in mind when we discuss race and policing, and particularly when we discuss the use of force by police officers. I'm told that you require all new agencies to study the FBI's interaction with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and to visit his memorial at the Tidal Basin. I'm also advised that you keep on your desk a copy of Robert Kennedy's approval of J. Edgar Hoover's request to place a wiretap on Dr. King. These are powerful reminders of a troubling and not too distant history. It's not difficult to draw a line from that era to recent events in Ferguson, Baltimore, New York, and Cleveland. And that's why your work to build trust between police and our communities is so important. Nowhere is that effort more apparent than in your call for better data on the use of force by police. Although the FBI is the national custodian of crime statistics, that data is reported voluntarily and inconsistently. You have been honest in your assessment that official statistics in this area are so incomplete as to be embarrassing and ridiculous. We need a better understanding of what drives police use of force, and we cannot study the problem without reliable data. I urge you to continue to press your state and local partners for consistent and accurate reporting to the National Incident-Based Reporting System. Just as we must rebuild trust in certain state and local law enforcement units, we will look to your testimony today to reassure us about a number of programs and activities at the FBI. Earlier this year, the public noticed a small plane flying in a tight pattern directly over the site of unrest in West Baltimore. Other reports from other parts of the country, including my own district in Detroit, raised questions about the presence of similar aircraft. The FBI has since confirmed the existence of its aerial surveillance program. On June 3rd, 15 members of this committee wrote you to ask for more information about this program. Your team provided our staff with a briefing soon thereafter, but the public still has many questions about aerial surveillance, and you've said that there is a great deal of misinformation about this program. I would like you to use your testimony and presence here today to explain from your perspective how this program works and why we should trust the Bureau to operate it. Similarly, I think we would benefit from a fuller description of encryption and what you've called the going dark problem. Over the past year, you have called for a congressional mandate to give the FBI special access to otherwise encrypted data. I have a difficult time understanding this proposal. Every technical expert who has spoken on this issue has concluded that it is technically impossible to provide this access without also compromising our security against bad actors. Even if it were technically feasible, it would cost our technology sector perhaps billions of dollars to implement the scheme, and perhaps billions more from loss of business overseas, where the United States government surveillance programs have already taken a toll on the industry. And even if it were technically feasible and easy to implement, a new rule for United States companies would not succeed in keeping bad actors from using unbreakable encryption, which is open source, free, and widely available from companies based overseas. As Chairman Goodlatte argued when we had this debate in 1999, only by allowing the use of strong encryption, not only domestically but internationally as well, can we hope to make the internet a safe and secure environment. I agree with that sentiment, and you have made similar public statements, and I hope that you can help us to reconcile that view with your call for special access. And finally, because rigorous oversight is necessary for public trust, I hope that you will commit today to full compliance with the Inspector General Act. For the past 5 years, the FBI has resisted the clear mandate of that law. The Inspector General of the Department of Justice is to have timely access to every document he requires to carry out his duties. Noncompliance has real consequences. This committee waited until February of this year to receive a report about the FBI's use of Section 215 orders from 2007 to 2009. The public waited until May for the unclassified version. In the middle of a national debate on government surveillance, we waited 6 years for critical information. This delay is unacceptable. I understand that there are other interpretations of the law. Congress will soon clarify the matter, likely in overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion. But in the meantime, Director Comey, I hope that the Bureau will step away from its litigating position and give the Office of the Inspector General the access it requires and deserves. Your job is a complex and demanding one, Director. We appreciate you being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. And I thank the Chairman and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Conyers. Without objection, all other members' opening statements will be made a part of the record. We welcome our distinguished witness today, and if you'll please rise, we'll begin by swearing you in. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Let the record reflect that the witness has responded in the affirmative. On September 4, 2013, Director Comey was sworn in as the 7th Director of the FBI. He began his career as an Assistant United States Attorney for both the Southern District of New York and the Eastern District of Virginia. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Director Comey returned to New York to become the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. In 2003, he was appointed Deputy Attorney General under United States Attorney General John Ashcroft. Director Comey is a graduate of the College of William and Mary and the University of Chicago Law School. We welcome you again today to your second appearance before the House Committee. Your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety, and we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. And with that, we welcome you again to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman Goodlatte. Congressman Conyers, it's good to be back before you and the members of the committee for my second annual oversight hearing. I expect to be back for 8 more during my 10-year term, which I look forward to very much. What I thought I would do is just explain to the committee in very short form how we at the FBI think about ourselves and a couple of the things that are prominent in our work today. I think the FBI can best be described in a single sentence. We are a national security and law enforcement organization that uses, collects, and shares intelligence in everything that we do. That sentence captures us in 2 different ways. First, the first half of that sentence, we are a national security and law enforcement organization. There is great strength for the American people in having our criminal responsibilities and our national security responsibilities in the same place. Perhaps no more better example is there of the strength that's gained from that combination than the rule of law as the spine of the FBI. It is a great thing, I think, for this country that the people responsible for counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and the criminal work all have as part of their being the rule of law and the Bill of Rights. The second half of that sentence, we use, collect, and share intelligence in everything that we do, is a description of what I think we've always been, but what we've tried to get so much better at since 9/11. That is being thoughtful about what we know, what we need to know, and who needs to know what we know, so that we can all be more effective in protecting this country. I want to touch on 2 topics under our responsibilities. Start with national security. The threat posed to us from ISIL's crowdsourcing of terrorism using social media is a significant feature of our work. It was an especially taxing threat the FBI dealt with earlier this summer when all over the country, in hundreds of investigations, we were trying to evaluate where people are from consuming ISIL's poison to acting on it. Through the internet, the so-called Islamic State has been pushing a twin-prong message to troubled souls all over the world and all over our country. The first prong is come to the so-called caliphate and live a life of glory. And if you can't come, the second prong says kill. Kill where you are, kill anyone. If you can kill people in uniform, military or law enforcement, best of all. That message has gone out since the summer of 2014 aggressively and in a very sophisticated way to thousands of consumers on Twitter. And Twitter works to sell books or movies or magazines. It works to crowdsource terrorism. And so in every state, we have investigations trying to understand where people are on the path from consuming to acting. And this is a very different paradigm than the traditional al-Qaeda paradigm, because this is not about national landmarks and sophisticated, long-tail, carefully surveilled events. This is about trying to motivate murder anywhere by anyone. And unfortunately, it's a message that resonates with troubled souls seeking meaning. And so earlier this summer, especially in May, June, and July, we were faced with the prospect of a whole lot of people acting out on this inspiration or direction from ISIL. And thanks to great work by the men and women of the FBI and our partners in state, local, and federal law enforcement, we disrupted a whole lot of efforts to murder innocent people in the United States. That work, though, continues, and it is made particularly difficult by an issue both you and Mr. Conyers touched upon. Our mission is to find needles in a nationwide haystack, and we have hundreds of investigations aimed at doing that in all 50 states. But increasingly, what ISIL does is move the real live ones who might be willing to kill on their behalf off of Twitter to a mobile messaging app that is end-to-end encrypted. And at that moment, the needle that we may have found becomes invisible to us, even with court orders, which is how the FBI does its business. And so that's the challenge we face, called going dark, in real living color. We are trying to interdict, trying to stop, trying to understand people on the cusp of acts of violence. And increasingly, a tool that the American people count on us to use is less and less effective. I don't know exactly what to do about that, frankly, but I think my job, given the responsibility I have, is to tell people there's a problem and we need to talk about it. And so I look forward to a conversation about it with you. Our law enforcement responsibilities is the second thing I just want to touch very briefly. Obviously, we do public corruption work, we protect children, we fight fraud. We do a whole lot of work with our partners around the country to address violent crime. Something very disturbing is happening in this country right now in law enforcement and in violent crime. I imagine two lines, one being us in law enforcement and the other being communities we serve and protect, especially communities of color. Those two lines over the last year or so have been arcing away from each other, and that continues. Each incident that involves police misconduct or perceived misconduct bends one line away. Each time an officer is killed or attacked on the line of duty bends the other line farther away. And in the midst of the arcing away from each other, maybe because they're arcing away from each other, we are seeing a dramatic spike in violent crime, especially homicide, in cities all across the country. In communities of color especially young men are dying at a rate that dwarfs what we've seen in recent history. It's happening all over the country, and it's happening all in the last 10 months. And so a lot of us in law enforcement are talking and trying to understand what is happening in this country, what explains the map we see, what explains the calendar. Why is it happening all over the country? Why is it happening this year? I don't know the answer to that. As I said, like a lot of people in law enforcement are struggling with it. We simply must focus on this because all lives matter. This is not a problem America should drive around. We should stare at it. And as we stare at it, we should all work for ways to bend those lines back towards each other because we need each other. We need each other to make sure our communities are safe. We have achieved in 2014 historically low violent crime in this country. We cannot let that slip away from us. I am grateful for the hard work of the men and women of the FBI on these challenges. I'm especially grateful for our partners in law enforcement around the country who help us address those. As you know, the FBI doesn't have a lot of fancy stuff. We have people, and we have great people, thank goodness, who are Americans who care deeply about protecting all of their fellow citizens. I am honored to be in this job where I get to watch what they do and help them, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director Comey. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions for the Director, and I'll begin by recognizing myself. Since the passage of the USA Freedom Act, a law that struck a balance between privacy and national security, is the FBI experiencing any difficulty in complying with the new law?
We have not, Mr. Chairman. We haven't yet gotten to the place where the system, the alternative system for telephone metadata has been built, but so far we haven't seen an adverse impact.
But you're getting very close to that, I think.
Yes, sir.
Date when metadata collection will be completely turned off.
Yep, end of next month, I believe.
Even with a decade's worth of information on Iraqi refugees, didn't we still encounter cases of domestic terrorism conducted by those admitted as refugees? With significantly less information on potential Syrian refugees, isn't it true that you can't ensure that the Iraqi experience is not going to be replayed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, you're correct that we did discover in people who had come in as refugees from Iraq a number of people who were of serious concern, including 2 that were charged when we found their fingerprints on improvised explosive devices from Iraq. And there's no doubt that that was the product of a less than excellent vetting that had been done on Iraqi refugees. There's good news and bad news. The good news is we have improved dramatically our ability as an interagency, all parts of the U.S. government, to query and check people. The bad news is our ability to touch data with respect to people who may come from Syria may be limited. That is, if we don't know much about somebody, there won't be anything in our database. In
fact, much less than we would have access to when we were in Iraq.
I think that's fair.
Had extensive networking and access to information about Iraqi citizens. That simply does not in any way compare to the lack of information we have today about Syrian nationals who are seeking refugee status in the United States.
I think that's a fair generality, that the data we had available to us from Iraq from a decade of our folks being there, encountering people, is richer than the data we have from Syria.
The director of the National Security Agency has said that former Secretary of State Clinton's private email server would be a sought-after target for a foreign intelligence agency. Do you also believe that a foreign intelligence agency, particularly in adversaries, could benefit from acquiring and exploiting sensitive and classified information of a top-level U.S. government official?
Mr. Chairman, I respectfully say that's one I'm not going to comment on. As you know, the FBI is working on a referral given to us by inspectors general in connection with former Secretary Clinton's use of a private email server. As you also know about the FBI, we don't talk about our investigations while we're doing them. This is one I'm following very closely and get briefed on regularly. I'm confident we have the people and the resources to do it in the way I believe we do all our work, which is promptly, professionally, and independently. But I don't want to do anything that would compromise my ability to do it that way by commenting beyond that.
Well, how about answering my generic question, not directed at the specifics of that case, but rather the question of whether you believe that a foreign intelligence agency, particularly in adversaries, could benefit from acquiring and exploiting sensitive and classified information of a top-level U.S. government official?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you'll understand why I don't think it's appropriate for me to answer that. I want to preserve my ability to oversee this investigation in a way that is both in reality independent and fair and is perceived that way. I believe the Bureau is 3 things. We are competent, we're independent, and we're honest. And I want to make sure the American people have confidence that that's the way we're doing our business. And if I start answering questions like yours, which is a reasonable question, I worry that I could infringe upon that.
You've said that encryption represents the going dark problem in high definition. Earlier this month, you testified in front of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee that the Obama administration has decided to no longer seek a legislative remedy to address challenges law enforcement faces with encryption and going dark. What has changed, and do you agree with the concerns that I and the ranking member, Mr. Conyers, have expressed about some of the proposals that had previously been made with regard to addressing this problem?
I think what the administration has decided, Mr. Chairman, is that it's not going to seek a legislative remedy now, so that we can continue the conversations we're having with the private sector, with our allies around the world, and with state and local law enforcement who are hugely impacted by this. And I think that makes good sense. I don't think we're yet to a place where we know exactly, so how would we fix this legislatively? This is a very hard problem. I think you and Mr. Conyers have raised serious questions and concerns. I believe this is an incredibly hard problem because 2 sets of values we all care about, safety and security on the internet. I'm a big fan of strong encryption for the reasons you said, It helps us fight cybersecurity, it helps us protect all that matters most to us personally and as a nation, and public safety that we all care about. And those two things are colliding with each other. There's not an easy answer, but given how important both of those values are and what's at stake, I think we have to wrestle with it, and we're continuing to do that. We're having very good conversations along all the dimensions I just said, and we'll continue it, I hope.
I just came from a meeting with Bill Gates, who indicated that the progress being made in quantum computing is dramatic, and that computers of that high capability will soon be able to crack any kind of encryption that anyone has. That I found to be very interesting information. I have both good and bad views of that, because obviously that can be seriously abused and invade the privacy of law-abiding citizens, but it also will be a source of solving your problem when you encounter encrypted materials by people who are suspected enemies of the United States, or criminals capable of using high technology to protect themselves and evade prosecution under the law. Do you have any comments or knowledge about the current state of quantum computing?
Nothing that would be useful to you. I've read about it in the popular press. I only have 8 years left in my term. I have a hard time imagining a police officer in New York City in a kidnapping case having access to a quantum computer anytime in the near future when they encounter a device that's locked. And so it may be someday that's an answer to the challenge, to the conflict of those two sets of values. I don't see it anywhere near in the near term.
Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome again, Mr. Director Comey. You observed that the Washington Post and the Guardian are becoming the lead source of information about violent encounters between police and civilians. You called the state of FBI statistics on these encounters embarrassing and ridiculous. And now that you've had some time to reflect on them, do you stand by this comment?
I do, Mr. Conyers. I think it's embarrassing for those of us in government who care deeply about these issues, especially the use of force by law enforcement, that we can't have an informed discussion because we don't have data. People have data about who went to a movie last weekend, or how many books were sold, or how many cases of the flu walked into an emergency room. And I cannot tell you how many people were shot by police in the United States last month, last year, or anything about the demographics. And that's a very bad place to be.
Why, sir, does the FBI have trouble collecting this information?
I think the big challenge, Mr. Conyers, is that it requires cooperation from 18,000 law enforcement organizations all around the country. And we are a big, diverse country of many different size organizations in the law enforcement space. And so we've never all sat together and said, let's change the way we do this. And I'm optimistic we're about to do that.
You're working on the problem, and you
Very
think
hard.
that it's coming together.
Very hard. And the good news is chiefs and sheriffs get it and want to be in a position we as a country can have informed conversations. And so what I've been asking for resonates with them. Yeah. I'm going to speak to them again at a huge conference in Chicago next week. And I'm optimistic that we can get to a much better place. It's going to take us a few years, but I think we can get to a much better place.
I hope so. Your written testimony takes a rather dim view of the so-called going dark problem. You want private companies to understand the public safety and national security risks that result from malicious factors, use of their encrypted products and services. In the past, you have balanced comments like these with an honest assessment of the benefits of strong encryption. I want you to take some time to do that here. Why is encryption important to the internet economy, to cybersecurity, and in many cases to our personal security.
Encryption is vital to our personal security because all of our lives are now online. I like people locking their cars when they go into a store. I like people to lock their homes so that people can't break in and steal what matters to them. Now what matters to us as people and as companies and as a country are online. And so it ought to be secured in a way so people can't steal our innovation, our identities, information about our children. So encryption is a very good thing, and the FBI has long said that. The challenge we face is that we never lived in a world with locks that couldn't be open on a judge's order. And so now we face that world where all of our lives will be covered by strong encryption. And so judges' orders under the Fourth Amendment will be unable to be complied with, and there are significant costs to that. And that's what I meant by the conflict of the values, public safety and security on the internet. And that's what makes it such a really hard problem.
Thank you. Over the summer, we received reports that a single-engine Cessna operated by the FBI and mounted with surveillance equipment had flown multiple times over Metro Detroit, including 2 lengthy flights over Dearborn, where many citizens feel reason to distrust the FBI because of their religious or ethnic background. You've been forthcoming to my staff about some of the details of this program. Can you give the public a similar overview here?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Mr. Conyers. When we investigate criminals or spies or terrorists, a key tool is surveillance to follow them. We follow them a lot in cars, we follow them on foot. There are plenty of circumstances where both of those options don't work real well. And so since the Wright brothers, we have used airplanes to follow people in our investigations. If a spy's going out to meet somebody and it's an area where we can't park cars, we'll sometimes try and get a small plane up to be able to get eyes on that meet with their contact. And so it's a feature, and I hope this doesn't shock the American people. I think I should be in trouble with them if we're not doing this. We use planes in our predicated investigations to conduct surveillance of people who are under investigation. We do not use planes for mass surveillance. Right? And so the good folks in Michigan who saw a plane in the air, I think a lot of them had a chance to meet with my SAC out there and have him explain, look, this is what we do in criminal cases. It should make sense if you understand how we use it in individual cases. So we have a small number of airplanes, actually wish we had more, that we use to follow people in places where it's hard to follow them on foot or in a car.
Thank you for your response to my questions.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Forbes, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Director Comey, thank you not just for being here, but for your service. I also want to thank all of your staff. I know the dedication they put into serving this country, and we appreciate them being here. If my friend Steve Shabbat were here, he would also commend you for your selection of William & Mary as an undergraduate, and I will tell you that if we couldn't convince you to go to the University of Virginia Law School, Chicago was probably a good second choice. But I have a question. As I listened to the ranking member today talk about trust, and he talked about the symbols that you have on your desk regarding police brutality and efforts by law enforcement. But you mentioned it was important to have reality and perception, both of those, when you're looking at that trust. Tell me the symbols, if you would, because what he raised was important, but tell me the symbols on your desk or in your office that would give me comfort in knowing that there was also a perception that you were equally looking at organized groups that were coming into areas like Ferguson and Baltimore to ferment unrest, especially groups that were outside those communities, and especially those groups who might be impacting violence against law enforcement. Because, as you mentioned, there are two curves, not just one curve.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Forbes. First of all, to make sure the record's clear, what I have on my desk, to me, is a message of the importance of restraint and oversight within government. And so it's a wiretap order that relates to Martin Luther King. It's not about law enforcement, police misconduct, which is something, obviously, police misconduct is something we take very seriously. I've devoted my whole life to law enforcement. I come from a law enforcement family. One of the things that's prominent in my office is a picture of my grandfather in 1929 escorting a dangerous felon to jail. My grandfather was a detective who rose up to lead a significant police department. And so I care an awful lot about making sure law enforcement has the confidence of the community, that we conduct ourselves well, but that we protect law enforcement from attacks. I call, one of the things in my office that reminds me, this is my phone. Whenever a police officer is killed in the line of duty, I call the chief or sheriff of that slain officer to offer the condolences of the FBI. I make far too many phone calls. And so we care about both, making sure law enforcement acts well and that we investigate people who would harm law enforcement, whether it's groups, sophisticated groups, or individual actors. It's a feature of all the work that we do.
And Director, I would just ask that at some point in time you could submit for the record the data you have on these outside groups that are coming into these communities when we have situations like this, who might be stirring up unrest and especially activity against law enforcement, and also any data you have regarding the impact or even the numbers of gang members that might be currently being released by the government who might be here illegally, because when we ask those questions to Homeland Security, they can't give us any of that data. Second question I'd have for you is, you know, the OPM breach impacted over 22 million current, former, and prospective federal employees and contractors. Considering these individuals use personal email accounts for their own personal communication and store private information relating to financial transactions, their children, and health care, do you think the OPM breach has made these individuals more vulnerable to social engineering tactics used by hackers? And in what ways could encryption enhance the security of personal information of those who have had their information compromised during the OPM breach?
I think the OPM breach, as I've said in other settings, is disastrous because it's a gold mine for foreign intelligence services that would allow them to use that material to conduct very sophisticated socially engineered spear phishing attacks, for example, to penetrate people's systems. I think encryption is very important to protect people's information. I don't think encryption will directly blunt that particular vector, because it would allow a nation state to send me an email from my sister about my nephew with an attachment, and it's highly likely I will open that email and click on that attachment. So I actually see them as two separate problems, both serious problems, though.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Rector. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Comey, for being here again. The National Instant Background Check System was created as a result of the Brady Act of 1993, before I was in the Congress, and it requires that gun sales by licensed gun dealers are subject to background checks, but allows transactions to proceed after 3 days unless the FBI stops the transaction based on criteria such as felony record or domestic violence, misdemeanor convictions, and the like. Now, under the rule, even if the FBI has not completed its check, the dealer has the discretion to complete the sale after 3 days have passed and they haven't received a red light from the FBI. That's my understanding from news reports that the man who shot and killed 9 people at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina on June 17th was sold a gun by a dealer who waited 5 days but did not receive a response from the NICS examiner. Now, the shooter had a drug possession conviction that, if it had been found by the NICS examiner, would have prevented the gun sale, due in part to an error in the shooter's arrest records and also the large caseload and time constraints placed on the NICS examiner. The gun dealer didn't receive the red light that would have prevented this gun sale and possibly prevented this massacre. So I have a couple of questions. First, what can be done to make sure that we have a timely response and we have the data available to prevent the sale of guns to those who are not eligible to buy them, number one. Number two, should the law require a green light from the FBI to prevent firearms transfer to those prohibited by law from buying them instead of the red light system that we have now? And do you think that we should examine the amount of time that we give for background checks beyond 3 days if we don't go to an affirmative green light system?
Thank you, Ms. Lofgren. With respect to the case of Dylan Roof, the as you said, the law gives dealers must wait 3 days, business days, to give the FBI an opportunity to conduct the background check. In that circumstance, the gun dealer was notified it was in delayed pending status, and at the end of 3 days, if it's still in delayed pending, the gun dealer has the discretion to transfer or to wait. Some large gun dealers wait. This gun dealer transferred, which was consistent with the law. And there were a number of errors in the processing of his that allowed his drug possession arrest to be missed, and so the gun was transferred. We have stared very, very hard at that and have tried to figure out what we can learn from that. There were some easy fixes to our processes, but we're looking at bigger fixes to see whether we can surge resources, whether we can add innovation to make our processing faster. But the other key piece is going to be we must get better records from our state and local partners so that when our examiners query a database, they have the disposition reported and they don't have to go tracking it down. We're having lots of productive conversations with state and local law enforcement who see in the wake of the pain of that tragedy that the importance of giving us those records. So that's what we're doing to try and improve our processing. The policy questions are really not for the FBI. We comply with the law as it stands today, which is we have 3 days to get it done. We'll do our best to get it done in 3 days. If Congress were to change that, we would comply, obviously.
All right. You know, getting back to encryption, I understand the concerns that you've raised here today and in the past, but the experts really say trying to get a backdoor is a mistake. I mean, all the way from the inventors of public key encryption, people like Whit Diffie, who did a very excellent report from MIT. If you have the backdoor, the hackers will get it, and China will get it, and we will be less safe. So that leads me to a question about the use of encryption by the FBI. Are you encrypting all of your data about your FBI agents and your personnel and your payroll and all of your systems?
There's no, we do not encrypt all of our data. We use encryption on a significant amount of our data. I'd have to follow up with you to give you the particulars on maybe a percentage breakdown, but it's an important feature of our work.
Well, I'd like to follow up with that because I was stunned that the Office of Personnel did not have that important data encrypted. The federal government should protect itself by encrypting this data. We know that we're being hacked constantly by state actors and enemies of our country, and I'm sure that they would love to get data about the FBI as well, and I look forward to hearing greater details on that. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentlewoman and recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got so many questions and so little time, so I'll try to touch on each of them and bear with me. On stingrays, I'm going to ask you to tell us now, or for the record, how you control the access to these products when they're not being used, how you control them when they are being used, not just at the FBI, but to the extent that you're cooperating with non-federal agencies around the country that have these devices. And specifically, I'm very concerned that since they're being used at times without warrant, mostly, and there are at least some allegations they've been used to track policemen's girlfriends or wives' activities and so on, that they are too powerful a tool not to have a series of controls. And I'd like to, again, some of this you can answer for the record. I think on that I'd like to have a full understanding of federal policy and controls. In the case of encryption, I'm only going to ask you to be a long answer, provide for the record, any and all studies you have to show the value of encryption and the value of your access or ability to not go dark. And if it's classified, I'll look at it in a classified session, but I'd like to fully understand the value in the studies related to that general direction of the administration. But I'd like to take up for today more a question on some historic pieces. A few offices away, they're dealing with Secretary Clinton and those, so I won't ask about those today. I think that's certainly an ongoing investigation as to her use of private email for transmitting what turns out to be sensitive information. But in the case of late 2011, well before your tenure, Solyndra went bankrupt after accepting $500 million in taxpayers' money. At that time, we began an investigation in an adjacent committee, the Oversight Committee, and we were told by the DOE Inspector General that he could not talk to us because the FBI at that time had an ongoing investigation. It's now 4 years later, and the department, the IG did release information, but we have not received any indication from the FBI. So today I'd like to ask you, who at the FBI made decisions not to bring any charges against Solyndra executives, and what the basis was to find no fault in that that loss of $500 million, and particularly since there was evidence provided publicly by our committee that there were emergency efforts to get them additional money to try to have their bankruptcy delayed, and that was done by federal employees, including a gentleman named Jonathan Silver. You might remember that in May in 2013, the President stood beside the Attorney General and declared that there would be serious investigation by DOJ and FBI into the political targeting done by the IRS. Months later, the President declared there wasn't a smidgen of corruption related to the IRS. Director, you know that in fact there was targeting. The evidence is convincing. Where do you stand on bringing accountability to those involved at all levels to targeting conservatives and pro-Israel groups by the IRS, including but not limited to Lois Lerner?
Okay. Thank you, Congressman. With respect to, so the first two, the stingrays and the encryption, we'll get you information on the record, for the record. With respect to Solyndra, first of all, just to clarify something, the FBI doesn't make decisions to prosecute. We investigate, bring the evidence to prosecute.
And I appreciate that, yeah. But there is either a decision to refer for prosecution or not. And to the extent that there was one, I would like the evidence that it was referred but not prosecuted. To the extent that there was a decision not to refer one or more, that would be helpful. I appreciate that the other part of justice handles the other part, and we will have the Attorney General here shortly.
Gotcha. We worked the Solyndra matter, we, the FBI, very, very hard, and had it reviewed by two different U.S. attorneys' offices, one in California, one in New York, who both made the same decision, that there was insufficient evidence to bring prosecutions. Probably limited in what I can say about the details of it here because it was a grand jury investigation, but that's the upshot of it. I had a lot of folks worked it very, very hard. One U.S. Attorney's Office looked at it. I asked that it be brought to a second U.S. Attorney's Office, my alma mater, Southern District of New York. They took a look at it and decided there was insufficient basis to prosecute criminally. And so that's where the matter stands. With respect to the IRS investigation, I think as I sit here, it's still pending, and so I'm not able to talk about it in any way because it's still a pending investigation.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to close with a very short comment. It was 2010 when we became aware that the IRS was targeting conservatives. It's now 2015, almost 2016. I really would appreciate if the FBI would come up with a timeline that says an investigation is not ongoing and aggressively pursued if a certain period of time passes and nothing has happened. I would only ask that 5 years begin to become an amount of time in which the FBI can say, we can't say with a straight face it's ongoing if it's 5 years later and nothing has happened. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to welcome you, and I'm a big fan of yours. But at the same time, I would like to ask you a question. I understand you keep a copy of the FBI's request to wiretap Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. on your desk as a reminder of the FBI's capacity to do wrong. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I commend you for that. That occurred during J. Edgar Hoover's tenure as director. As you know, J. Edgar Hoover did some awful, terrible things in his life and as FBI director. He started the COINTELPRO. I might be mispronouncing that. How do you pronounce that?
I think you got it.
COINTELPRO program, which harassed civil rights workers, SNCC people, SLC people, Dr. King in particular, others, political activists and homosexuals. He was abusive. He was the opposite of justice. His efforts to silence Dr. King and out homosexuals working for the federal government were deplorable and a stain on our nation's history and on the FBI. It's been reported that at one point he even had a letter sent to Dr. King threatening to expose all kinds of private information collected surreptitiously. The letter appeared to suggest that Dr. King should kill himself to save himself from embarrassment. King, there's only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You have just 34 days in which to do it. You are done. There's but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. This was the head of the FBI. His treatment of homosexuals was no better. He called them sex deviants. He ordered the FBI to undertake extraordinary efforts to identify everyone in the Bureau who was even suspected of being homosexual in the federal government. There's a documentary been done on this. It's on yahoo.com by Michael Isaacoff called Uniquely Nasty. I encourage you to watch it. I watched it and was shocked. Premiered at the Newseum. It's sickening what the FBI did. In 1951, Hoover issued a memo to top FBI officials saying each supervisor will be held personally responsible to underline in green pencil the names of individuals who are alleged to be sex deviants. This was discovered through a FOIA effort 2 years ago. The FBI eventually collected more than 360,000 files on gays and lesbians. It's reported in 1952 he outed a young campaign aide, Vandenberg Jr., and went on a war on him, and Senator Vandenberg, a Republican, eventually committed suicide in the Senate office because of what they brought out about his son and what they were doing to destroy him. J. Edgar Hoover was a man that doesn't reflect the good people of the FBI or reflect what you and the FBI are trying to do today. The FBI on its own website declared the COINTELPRO program as rightly criticized by Congress and the American people for abridging First Amendment rights and other reasons. Yet his name continues to adorn the FBI building. Would you agree that his name is not appropriate as a reflection on what the fine people at the FBI today try to do to bring about justice in our country?
I'm sorry, that Hoover's name?
Yes, sir.
I'm not following the question.
I'm saying, does it not reflect the qualities that the FBI individuals and the FBI today have in pursuing justice and being fair and not using tactics to attack minorities in this country?
I see. Thank you. I'm sorry. The FBI today is vastly different than it was under its first director in some of the ways you mentioned and in lots of other ways. I keep that under the glass of my desk, not to dump on Hoover. I never knew the man, but to make sure people understand the danger in falling in love with your own view of things, and the danger in the absence of constraint and oversight. Right? I am somebody who believes people should be very skeptical of government power. Right? I'm a nice person. I suppose you should trust me, but you should oversee me, and I should be checked, and I should be balanced. That's the way you constrain power. It's there to remind me.
Yes, sir, and I agree, and I appreciate that, but do you agree that his name is not reflective of what the FBI stands for and what the FBI agents of today believe in and do?
I think that's fair if you're focusing on, Hoover did a lot of good things for law enforcement in the United States, did a lot of things that, through the lens of history, we reject as improper. And so I'm no historian, but I would imagine a historian would say you got to take the total measure of the person and figure out what's bad, what's good. And I'm just not equipped to do that.
Thank you, sir. I would like to see his name taken off the building and have a bill. Representative Burton had it with Chris Shays in the past, and I'm going to reintroduce that bill. But I would hope, as I mentioned to you the last time, that we have a new building sometime in the future, it's named for somebody like you.
Well, I appreciate that. I hope it's
or
not named for
Congressman
me.
Edwards,
yeah.
or Attorney General Kennedy.
Yeah.
And I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Comey, thanks for coming to testify, and I just would comment that I appreciate your response when you use the reference the lens of history. There's a different set of values that applies today than applied back in those days. But I'm looking at our values today, and I'm watching as there is a fairly strong push here for sentencing reform in the United States. And I've watched as the President, or the administration at least, has directed that thousands be released onto the streets before they serve their terms, and that we've seen that some of them have been charged with homicide and found guilty of homicide. I think that number is around 121 or so. but I saw another number, 36,007 felons released, and then a subsequent number. I'm actually blurred by the parade of releases that we've seen, and now I see appears to be a group of legislators that believe we can save some tax dollars by releasing more onto the streets. Are you aware of any studies that would help us quantify the impact of these releases in terms of either prospective crimes that are likely to be committed, or perhaps even quantifying it in terms of the dollar value that's suffered in great, huge, whopping chunks by crime victims?
I'm not aware of any studies on that. It's not that I would be. That's sort of a policy question, but I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, and they're very hard to find. I've searched a long ways back from. I'm going from memory. It occurs to me that in 1992 there was a Justice Department study that did quantify numerically the cost of crime. But you have any studies that show statistically whether there'd be more crime or less crime that would take place because of the releases, the early releases?
I'm not aware of any studies on that.
What would be your professional estimate? I don't need a number. Would we have more crime or less crime?
Well, I know we face as a country a significant challenge with recidivism, right? High reoffend rate among people who are released. And my whole career is dedicated to the proposition that law enforcement contributes to a drop in crime. It's certainly not entirely responsible for the historic drop in crime we've seen over my lifetime, but it's a big part of it. And so that's the way I think about it.
Mandatory sentencing statistically shows to have had a positive impact on reducing the crime in the streets of America?
I think so. Mandatory minimums have been an important part of my work as a prosecutor. Reasonable people can discuss whether it should be at this level or this level, but some mandatory sentence, some fixed prospect of punishment is very, very valuable in incapacitating people and in developing cooperators.
And some time back, I sat down with a very impressive chief of police of one of our major cities who remarked to me about the very high homicide rate in the inner city of his city. And his response was that the black-on-black homicide rate in that city was roughly 98% of the homicides that took place. I don't know that we discuss these kind of statistics, and I'd be hopeful that we could find a way to do this and alleviate this situation that we have. I'd say we've gone into a void on this for politically correct reasons, but are you aware of any data that would reflect what I've represented to you?
I think there's a lot of data collected by criminologists and others on the demographics of homicide victims and perpetrators. I can't cite it to you off the top of my head, but I know there's smart people who've done that work.
And that 98% number, that wouldn't be shocking to you if that were proven out to be true by a legitimate study?
I don't think it would shock me in particular neighborhoods that are heavily concentrated with people of a certain demographic background, but I don't know the number off the top of my head.
Yes, thank you. Is there an investigation of Planned Parenthood currently taking place in the FBI?
I know, Congressman, as I sit here, I'm not able to answer that question because I don't know enough. I know there's been letters written to the Department of Justice about it. I'll have to get back to you on that one because I don't know the status of matters within the FBI on that sitting here this morning.
Has anyone from the administration, to your knowledge, ever sought to influence you or any of your subordinates on whether or not to investigate a crime?
Never.
And specifically not Planned Parenthood either would be included in that?
That would be included.
And I think that would be consistent with your competent, independent, and honest characteristics of the FBI. I'll just pose this question that, let me quickly go another way. USA Freedom Act, you're implementing it now. And do you have access to more or less information than you had before the USA Freedom Act was passed?
It really hasn't changed because we're still under the old telephone metadata system. As I said to the chairman, I think the new one kicks in at the end of November. So and currently, our world is unchanged.
Okay. You expect more or less?
I expect more, actually.
That'll be interesting to follow up on if I had another minute, but I will yield back and thank the chairman.
The gentleman does not have another minute, but the chair will recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu, for 5 minutes.
Director Comey, I want to discuss with you a series of very troubling federal investigations against Chinese-American scientists who are treated as spies, have their lives turned upside down, only to have all the charges dropped. Most recently, we have the case of Dr. Xiaoxing Shi, an American citizen and a well-respected professor who was the chair of the physics department at Temple University. He led a normal and peaceful life as a scientist, professor, and researcher with his 2 daughters and a wife in a quiet Pennsylvania neighborhood. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, just an average American in academia. But one day at the break of dawn, about a dozen armed FBI agents stormed into his house with their guns drawn. He was handcuffed in his own home, and his 2 young daughters and wife in pajamas and directed outside of the house at gunpoint. The stated charge? Wire fraud. However, in the interrogation, it was clear he was being accused of being a spy for China. Since then, his life has been turned upside down. He lost his title as chair of the physics department. His reputation was irreparably damaged. His wife endures psychological and emotional trauma, as does his whole family and himself, of course. And after all of this, the charges against Dr. Shi were dropped. My understanding of cases of wire fraud is that generally people aren't even handcuffed, let alone arrested or paraded in front of their family and neighborhood as criminals at gunpoint. Rather, they'd be given an opportunity to self-surrender. And if someone is being investigated for wire fraud, they're usually informed about such an investigation in a target letter. But we know that Professor Shi is not alone. Sherry Chen was also recently arrested, a U.S. citizen and employee of the National Weather Service in Ohio. She was arrested at her place of work, led in handcuffs past her coworkers to a federal courthouse 40 miles away, where she was told she faced 25 years in prison and $1 million in fines. Several months later, all the charges were dropped without any explanation. This is reminiscent, of course, of Dr. Wen-Ho Lee, another U.S. citizen whose life was ruined when he was accused of being a spy for China, only to have 58 of the 59 charges dropped. Let us not forget that during World War II, 120,000 Japanese Americans lost everything they had and were imprisoned in desolate camps because they were accused of being spies for Japan. 3/4 of them were U.S. citizens. 70 years later, not a single case of espionage was proven. I'm particularly concerned about this because there is a stereotype that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners, no matter how long they've lived in this country. So my question to you is this common practice to have a dozen armed FBI agents arrest someone for wire fraud, someone who is not a flight risk and poses no harm to law enforcement? Or is there a presumption of guilt when it comes to Chinese Americans because they are viewed as spies for China?
Thank you, Congresswoman. At the outset, the challenge, I'm going to answer the challenge for me in answering is I can't talk about the facts of something that is of an investigation, including ones that are pending. I guess I can say this. First of all, we operate with no presumption that anyone is guilty or any stereotype about any particular person. We are a fact-based organization. We're required to gather facts and then, through a prosecutor, present them to a judge to make a showing of probable cause before we can get a warrant to arrest anybody. A whole lot of people in this country are arrested on wire fraud charges. I've been involved in many cases where people were handcuffed and arrested because wire fraud is a very serious felony. The particulars of the case I can't talk about, but I would not connect the dots in the manner that you have. And that's probably all I can say about individual matters.
Well, we understand that the threat of economic espionage is real, and we do not take it lightly. However, we want to make sure that in all cases there is due process and that otherwise innocent Americans do not become suspicious simply because the person taking those actions have an ethnic surname. Yet in the case of Professor Shi, his investigation came out of the blue. He had no idea he was being investigated, primarily because he did nothing wrong, as evidenced by the dropped charges. Do you know how many Chinese Americans are being surveyed?
I do not.
Well, I will personally follow up with you on this issue to figure out what is happening in cases like Professor Shi's and how we can make sure that no other American, regardless of their origin or background, endures this kind of egregious humiliation and shame. And with that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomer, 5 minutes.
Hello, Director Comey. Thank you for being here. I don't think I ever told you, but back in July, August time frame of 2007, I was talking with a powerful Democratic senator, and we agreed that you had a great reputation for justice, honorable man that would potentially be a good attorney general. It ended up being McCasey, but you were discussed very favorably by both sides of the aisle, people unlikely to be talking, but we appreciate your work. I wanted to touch on something my friend Steve King brought up. I know there's a lot of talk about how we need to have reform and people being released from prison, but as someone who has worked with the system, you've prosecuted, I've been a judge, I've been court appointed to defend. And isn't it true that some people that actually plead to nonviolent offenses do so as part of a plea agreement where the prosecutor drops a gun charge or some charge of violence in order to get a plea in the case and a lesser sentence? Haven't you seen that happen?
I've seen that happen.
Yes. And so that's why, for someone like me who's a former judge who saw those kind of plea agreements take place, even though I was in the state side, it's shocking to see people come from the outside and say that this wasn't a fair sentence without really considering what could have been prosecuted, what could have been pursued, and what was, a transaction, an agreement between a prosecutor, a defense attorney, that the judge considered all the circumstances and came down on the side of the agreement. Now, I want to touch on something else you had said about with Iraq refugees. You had a database, apparently, of fingerprints from IEDs, evidence that had been obtained from Iraq. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, sir.
Now, with regard to the masses of Syrian refugees, I'm not aware of a lot of IEDs that we've gotten, evidence we've gotten from which you could get fingerprints. Is there such a database?
I think that's right. There may be some, and a variety of other intelligence sources that may help us try and understand who people are. But the point I was trying to make is we had a whole lot more information about
Right.
Iraq because our soldiers had been there,
Right.
run into people, and collected information.
Well, and that goes to a concern of mine. I'm not the biggest fan of the UN, but they have data pulled from their website this morning that says, starting off, that more than 43 million people worldwide are now forcibly displaced as a result of a conflict and persecution. And it goes on to say that children constitute about 41% of the world's refugees, and about half of all refugees are women. So it was very disturbing to pull this from the UN website in September that says of the 381,412 arrivals that came across the Mediterranean Sea just this year up to September, that 15% were children, 13% were women, and 72% were men. And then when you take that along with our DNI, James Clapper, saying that this provides a prime opportunity for Islamic State groups to attack Western targets, he said, quote, it's a disaster of biblical proportions. And then you take statements that have been made by ISIS leaders themselves that they have been able to place more than 4,000 warriors in with the refugees, this inordinate number of men. Has that spiked concern in the FBI, along with what you've testified before about ISIS having people in every state?
Yes, sir. It's a risk that we are focused on and trying to do everything we can to mitigate.
But without a good fingerprint database, without good identification, I mean, how can you be sure that anyone is who they say they are? You don't have fingerprints to go against. If they've got documents that say they're one, I've been out on the border when I've watched people exchange identification information and decide to use the other ones. Is there a good way to avoid that the FBI is able to use?
The only thing we can query is information that we have. And so if we have no information on someone, they've never crossed our radar screen, never been a ripple in the pond, there will be no record of them there, and so it will be challenging.
Okay, thank you. My time's expired. I yield back.
Chair, thanks. Gentlemen, recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Gutierrez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Director. I'm just going to have a conversation about one area, and that's about guns. In my hometown, there could be 40, 50 shootings in a weekend. It's about a whole classroom of kids any weekend. And so I know that, you know, you have a relationship with making sure that we check who can and cannot purchase guns. You're the FBI. And it just seems that whatever we do in Chicago, guns are just, well, first, our laws have been weakened because there have been challenges to them. So we used to have pretty strong. When I first got elected in 1986 to Chicago City Council, they give you a badge, Chicago, and you can get a gun. I opted not to take the badge or the gun. I figured the Chicago police could do both of those things, wear the badge and carry the gun for me and for the rest of the people. I think the people of the city of Chicago were well served by me making that decision. But look, so here we have like a majority in the Congress of the United States that's really unwilling to take up the challenge that guns and firearms, and they're coming from Indiana, and they're coming from Mississippi, and they're coming from all over, and they wind up in Chicago. We have this. So I guess if you could just tell us, what are your ideas on how do I and people at a local level or as a member of Congress, how do I help curb gun violence? What things can we do to help curb absent legislation?
Well, the FBI's business is not policymaking, it's enforcement of the law. And so we spend a lot of time trying to reduce gun violence through aggressive enforcement. It's a crime for a felon to possess a gun in this country, for a drug addict, for a drug dealer, for someone who's convicted of domestic violence, misdemeanor to do it, to use it in any crime of violence. And so I've devoted a lot of my career as a prosecutor, now the FBI does investigating, to impose costs, to change behavior so the bad guys don't have a gun on their waistband. And that means more fistfights, maybe more stabbings, but fewer shootings, because the challenge we face in a lot of cities is the bad guys think it's just another piece of clothing. So they think about as much about the gun as they do about their socks. And that leads to a whole lot more shooting based on people bumping into each other, frankly. And so our mission is to try and send a strong message of deterrence that you ought not to have that gun. You ought to think a lot more about the gun than your socks. And that will make that corner safer. But it requires tremendous effort by the law enforcement community. We're doing a lot of that, though, including in Chicago, where your characterization is exactly right.
What kinds, could you tell us, the members, what kinds of things are we doing in Chicago vis-a-vis your agency and the federal government to help the people of the city?
Well, in Chicago, we've actually gone so far as to put FBI agents with Chicago police officers in squad cars to try and focus on some of the predators who are driving this violence, the gangbangers who think that they operate freely. So we do gang task forces, we do drug task forces, and as I said, we operate even on a ad hoc basis to try and lock up some of the repeat offenders. And the idea there is to try and change behavior by ripping out the worst and convincing the rest you should not have a firearm with you if you are a prohibited person.
So as I look at the challenge of gun violence in the city of Chicago, and I see that there are, I mean, if we took a map of the city of Chicago and we put reluctantly little stars where people had been murdered due to gun violence, we would see, do you see it as, do you know or have you seen, is it the whole city of Chicago? When I look at it, I'm not that worried about my grandson walking in Portage Park to the park. I'm worried, but not that worried as I would be in other neighborhoods of the city of Chicago. So what other dimensions are there that relate to gun violence, as you've seen?
Yeah, I know the city of Chicago pretty well, having gone to law school and been there many, many times. And the story of Chicago is a lot like the story of bunch of cities around the country, it's localized. The violence is heavily concentrated. Chicago, primarily south, some west, obviously. And it is groups of primarily young men who are carrying firearms when they're prohibited by law from carrying them on the streets, and that inevitably leads all human encounters ratchet up to the most serious available weapon. And so what would have been a fist fight when you were a kid today is a shootout because the gun is there. And what we in law enforcement are trying to do is change that behavior. These kids may not be well educated, but they're very good at cost-benefit analysis. And the idea is to force a cost-benefit analysis. That gun should be a huge liability in the eye of that felon, that drug dealer, that drug addict. And that's the way we hope to change behavior.
So, Mr. Director, just 15 seconds and I'll finish up, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Director, there are a group of us in the Hispanic Congressional Caucus and African American members of color. We'd like to have a roundtable discussion with you, a conversation from different parts of the United States, and not in such a formal setting as this, in which you might be able to share with us how better in communities of color in America where the gun violence is so rampant, you might give us some of your thoughtful input. Would you agree to do that with us? Thank you so much, Mr. Director.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, thank you for being here. I'm going to talk about several subjects, see how many of them I can get in 5 minutes. First, I want to talk about EPCA, the idea that under current law, that if email is stored in the cloud, government doesn't need a warrant to obtain that email. Is that your understanding of the law?
I think the law is, and you probably know better than I, but I think it's after 180 days.
Yes, after 180 days.
Right. We still operate under a warrant, the FBI does, that's just our policy, but I think that's the law. If it's older than 180 days, it can be gotten through other legal process.
And thanks for the correct clarification. It's after 180 days. Before 180 days or during 180 days, you've got to have a warrant, no matter who you are. FBI policy is, though, you still get a warrant if it's over 180 days.
Correct.
But other government agencies still have the ability to seize that email without a warrant. Law enforcement. I mean, it could be a local law enforcement, it could be city police, sheriff's department. Other law enforcement can seize that email in their jurisdiction because the law doesn't require they get a warrant. I mean, is that your understanding of the law?
They would need some kind of legal process. They couldn't just walk in and take it, but my understanding is the law would permit them to get it through a subpoena or some other court order short of a warrant.
That's right. So they don't need a warrant. They need some other court document from a magistrate, if so. Yeah. And I'm sure you're aware that myself and Zoe Lofgren have filed legislation to require any law enforcement agency, any government agency, to obtain a warrant if emails are over 6 months old, stored in the cloud. You aware of that legislation?
I am. I'm generally aware. Yes, sir.
Okay. Next subject, 702. Talk about the backdoor, obtaining backdoor information on from different companies such as Google or Yahoo or whoever. Does the FBI request that a backdoor device be put into like a cell phone?
I don't know what you mean by backdoor device.
Well, where the FBI could obtain the information in the cell phone without a warrant, and you can ask the maker of the phone, for example, to install a device in the phone to obtain that information.
Oh, I see. Now, we would need a court order to be able to, either in a device or online, to be able to take content or implant something in a phone. Not just a warrant. We would need a Title III order or a FISA court order.
My question, though, is does the FBI request, and maybe you don't, manufacturers to put a device in the phone itself to obtain that backdoor information, to have it available and then a warrant obtained?
No.
Don't request that?
Nope.
Okay.
Now, when we collect information, it's pursuant, we're talking about the content of people's communication or what they've stored on a device. We do it through a court order. We don't do it through asking someone who made the device to give us access to it voluntarily.
Okay. And you say court order, are you talking about a warrant or some other type of court order?
Right. Either a search warrant from a judge to open a locked device or an order from a federal judge, either in a national security case or a criminal case, if we're looking to intercept communication as it's moving.
I think that the Fourth Amendment applies to that type of procedure, and you're saying the FBI complies with the law, the Fourth Amendment, on obtaining that information.
Yes, the Fourth Amendment is part of the sort of the spine of the FBI.
It's the what of the FBI?
The spine of the FBI.
I am glad to hear that. Let's talk about surveillance with the use of drones and fixed-wing aircraft. Specifically, targeted surveillance with the use of a drone. Does the FBI obtain a warrant to do that? Using up a drone, fixed-wing aircraft or a drone, whichever you want to call it.
Yeah, any kind of aircraft we don't, if what we're doing is, which is what we use them for, we'll have a pilot fly around and follow somebody. Drones, we don't. We have a small number of unmanned aircraft. We may use them for fixed surveillance, like when that guy had the kid in the bunker in Alabama. We used a drone to go over the top because we were afraid he would shoot one of the pilots. We had an unmanned aircraft, but we operate drones within line of sight, right? So we have to.
Okay.
So when we're talking about surveilling someone, we're really talking about an airplane with a human being in it flying them around. Right. We do not get a warrant for that. Law doesn't require it. But that's not involved with collecting the communications of somebody.
I understand.
Yeah.
I understand the difference being, I'm not talking about exigent circumstances. I'm just any circumstance the law doesn't require, or there is no law saying the Fourth Amendment applies to the use of drones. The FAA makes those decisions, does it not?
Right. To follow somebody in a car or on foot or in a plane, we have to have a predicated investigation, but we don't have to go to court to get permission to follow that.
Do you think the FBI ought to make the rules regarding protection of the Fourth Amendment, or should Congress weigh in on what reasonable expectation of privacy should be regarding that type of issue?
Yeah, the FBI doesn't make any laws. Congress makes the laws, and the courts interpret them.
I didn't say the FBI. We're claiming my time if the chair would be so patient. The FAA, not the FB, not the FBI, the FAA may make the regulations on what you can do with a drone and what you can't do. I think that Congress ought to weigh in and determine what the reasonable expectation of privacy ought to be with the use of drones. Do you have an opinion on that, being the director of the FBI? You want the FAA to continue to do it, or you think Congress ought to set that standard?
I don't think
The
I have.
time of the gentleman has expired, but we'll permit the director to answer.
I don't think I have a view or a preference. I mean, the FBI, we are maniacs about wanting to follow the law. So if Congress decided to change the law, we would follow it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Comey, in your testimony, you mentioned how ISIL and other terrorist organizations field potential recruits in publicly accessible social networking sites and via encrypted private messaging platforms. Could you detail the issues that law enforcement is facing due to the end of encryption?
Yes, sir. The ISIL challenge illustrates the problem we call going dark, that ISIL increasingly uses when they find someone who I call a live one, that is someone who might be able to motivate to engage in acts of violence in the United States. They move them from Twitter or Twitter direct messaging. Twitter direct messaging is available to us with court process, to a mobile messaging app that's end-to-end encrypted, meaning if we get a court order from a judge and intercept the communication, we can't decipher it, we can't read it. And so those people, their communications become invisible to us even with a court order. That's the challenge. That we actually face that in all kinds of criminal cases as well, but it is very well illustrated by the ISIL challenge. That's what I mean when I talk about that.
So in other words, a foreign-based person, a foreign person operating from a foreign location using social network such as Twitter can identify a potential target for radicalization, or someone who's already radicalized but who's reaching out to this foreign-based person, and then they can take it to another site where their communications are encrypted, correct?
Correct.
And because they're encrypted, then law enforcement, whether or not it has a warrant or not, cannot discover what they are talking about, even though they know that this foreign-based person is a ISIL member.
That's correct, and we'd have to have a court order, but the court order would be useless.
Yeah. So now the practical impact of that is what?
That we can't know what somebody who's planning on an act of violence against a police officer, a military member, or a civilian is up to and when they're going to act. And we're limited to physical surveillance, trying to watch them and figure out what they're going to do, or trying to get other ways to get visibility into what they're up to. So it is darkness, right? They go dark to us in a way that's really important in those matters.
Okay, and you mentioned about traditional crimes, domestic crimes, and how encryption hurts your ability to get at domestic criminal activity. Can you talk about how in a case of hot pursuit or exigent circumstances this adversely affects our ability to keep Americans safe from domestic crime?
There's lots of different ways in which it impacts. In fact, I believe the going dark problem overwhelmingly affects state and local law enforcement. People talk about it like it's an intelligence question, but it's actually almost entirely a law enforcement question because, I mean, to give you an example that a lot of DAs talk about, if they recover a cell phone, right, at a scene where someone has been murdered or been kidnapped, they cannot open the device, even with a court order, to figure out who was that person communicating with before they disappeared. That's the most basic example. We also are increasingly encountering it where drug gangs or carjacking gangs are communicating using apps, text apps that we cannot, that are encrypted end to end, and with a court order we can't read. So it's becoming increasingly, the logic of it is it will affect all of our work at some point. Hundreds and hundreds of cases will eventually be affected by it because it is all of our lives are becoming part of the digital world, and when the digital world is covered by strong encryption, judges will not be able to order access in serious criminal cases or national security cases. That's the future we're coming towards, and my view is maybe that's where we want to be, but we ought to talk about it as we're going to that place.
Well, thank you for your responses to my questions, and I'll yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman and recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman and director. Thank you for being here. The FBI has had to change through the course of time since my grandfather, who was a career FBI agent, served. I have great admiration for the agency and what you in particular are doing. I want to go back to cyber. We talk a lot about cyber. Can you articulate the size, scope, and investment that you have in both personnel dollars to address the cyber threat that's going to continue in perpetuity?
Yeah. Thank you, Congressman. I probably can't give you exact numbers sitting here, but we have a cyber division at headquarters that does nothing but cyber-related work, and then cyber task forces in every single FBI field office, cyber squads. But that doesn't quite capture it because all of the threats we're responsible for come at us through the internet now, whether it's kids being protected or terrorists coming after us. And so everybody actually has to be, in a way, a cyber analyst or a cyber agent. So I could give you specifics on how many hundreds, thousands of people are assigned to do cyber work, but it's actually even broader than that.
What is it that you can't do? That is there another department or agency that's doing something that the FBI couldn't do?
In the cyber realm?
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I can't think of it sitting here. Our responsibilities are obviously confined to the United States, and so we work with our partners, NSA in particular, in trying to fight the cyber threat that's coming from overseas. The Bureau doesn't have the ability to reach out in that way. And so that's...
Let me ask you in the context of the United States Secret Service. I was surprised to learn that two-thirds of an agent's, the agents that they have, two-thirds of their time is spent on investigations and cyber. And it begs the question to me, why do we have such a small group of people doing that, which the FBI has a much bigger resource, infrastructure, and expertise in doing? And as we look at potentially restructuring the Secret Service and getting more focused on the protective mission, why not combine the two? Or what is it that they do that you don't want to do, or that they do that you can't do? I'm trying to get my arms around.
Yeah, it was such a good question. I misunderstood it. I'm sorry. One of the things I've been trying to do is drive us closer together with the Secret Service, because they have expertise, especially in the financial-related intrusions and credit card scams. They've spent years developing that expertise, and so I don't want to duplicate it. So we're trying to drive ourselves together. I'd like us to combine our task forces. It doesn't make any sense for them to have an electronic crimes task force and me to have a cyber task force. There ought to be one. They do great work. I want to make sure we don't duplicate, and I want to do joint training with them. They're doing some great training, so are we. That's one of the things we can't do. We can't do enough for state and local law enforcement to help them deal with digital crimes.
So in terms of the personnel that you have associated with that, how would that work? Are there other agencies that would also, I mean, Secret Service is but one. Are there other agencies that should be also included in that? Because we got a Homeland Security organization that thinks they should be in charge of all the cyber.
Yeah, I think with respect to the criminal work that we do, there are people at HSI within Department of Homeland Security who are doing cyber-related crime work. And then there's a lot of state and local law enforcement doing it, and they are part of our task forces.
This, can you give me any more, shedding more light on the FBI's Next Generation Cyber Initiative? Explain that to me a little bit more.
Yeah, without eating up all your time, it's our strategy, my strategy for where we're going to take the FBI in the next 3 to 5 years. And so it involves deploying our people in a different way, getting better training, better equipment, focusing ourselves on the threats that I think the FBI, given its footprint, is best able to address. So it's our sort of whole of FBI approach to cyber over the next 3 to 5 years.
And so when you have an FBI, you have FBI personnel that will focus potentially their entire career just on cyber, correct? They won't necessarily be bouncing around to different tasks?
Correct.
All right. I appreciate the time. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and we'll now recognize Mr. Deutsch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Comey, thanks so much for being with us today. I represent South Florida, Broward County and Palm Beach County, and we're experiencing an alpha PVP or FLACA epidemic. Broward County is the epicenter of the ongoing national FLACA crisis. In Broward, the number of cases is spiraling out of control. The Broward County Sheriff's Office has stated that in January 2014, they analyzed a single FLACA case. By September 2014, they were analyzing 80 cases. This year, the Sheriff's Office has reported analyzing approximately 100 cases per month. FLACA cases are also flooding the county health system. The Broward Health System has reported that they're receiving on average 12 cases per day. In this past year, it has contributed to the death of 45 people in Broward County. FLACA use has also started to spread northward into Palm Beach County. In 2014, there were 35 submissions involving FLACA to the Palm Beach Sheriff's Office Crime Lab. In 2015, there have been 42. There have been 10 arrests in Palm Beach County, and FLACA is now moving into Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and other states. As you're aware, people using FLACA experience hallucinations, delirium, violent outbursts, and extreme body temperatures that often cause their users to remove their clothes. FLACA is extremely cheap. It costs $5, and it can be easily purchased online from China. The low cost of the drug and the easy access are very troubling. FLACA, as is the case with other synthetic drugs, is extremely difficult for law enforcement to prosecute. The primary problem is that the composition of the synthetic drugs can't be pinpointed and classified as illegal because the drugs are constantly changing their composition. And as soon as the synthetic drug is listed as illegal, the composition is changed ever so slightly to evade the listing that made the drug more readily available. In fact, a recent news report in Miami found that FLACA is now being made into gummy bears. Gummy bears. The only difference between the real ones and FLACA gummy bears is that the ones containing FLACA are individually wrapped and stickier. Dealers are using them now to hook young people. So if you could target the efforts that the FBI has taken to crack down on this epidemic of synthetic drugs, FLACA in particular, and speak to the challenges that you face in cracking down on, again, these sorts of cases involving FLACA and other synthetic drugs.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. The synthetic, I think the word is cannabinoids, And my friend Chuck Rosenberg, the leader of the DEA, is probably laughing listening to me mispronounce it, but it is a serious problem that I hear about all over the country. So DEA obviously has the lead on the federal level, but we are participating through our drug task forces with DEA in trying to do something about that scourge, which you're exactly right. It's appearing in gas stations or little markets where kids can walk up and buy these things not knowing exactly what they're buying, and it will wreck their life.
And the current law permits synthetic drugs to be treated as a controlled substance if they're proven to be chemically and or pharmacologically similar to Schedule I or Schedule II controlled substances. But as I said, as I pointed out, the nature of the drugs keeps changing. They change the chemical structure to avoid being listed as a controlled substance. So question to you is, what steps can lawmakers take to help in your efforts, local enforcement efforts as well, to crack down on this epidemic?
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I know from talking to Acting Administrator Rosenberg that they are keenly focused on that problem, which is every time they schedule one of these things, it comes in from China slightly different, and so it's not scheduled anymore. They're sort of chasing it, playing whack-a-mole with a very dangerous substance. I don't know what the answer is, frankly.
Well, I would, Judge Comey, I would invite representatives of your task force and the DEA to come to South Florida. This is an issue that dominates the headlines. It's an issue that affects young people, and as you point out, the moment that somebody takes one of these synthetic drugs, Flocka, which is so readily available in Florida and elsewhere, it changes and often ruins their lives. So I'm grateful for your focus on it, and I hope we have the opportunity to do something down in South Florida to really raise the issue so that we can know, the people in South Florida can know what this focus is and how much we can do about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
And I thank the gentleman. We'll now recognize Mr. Marino for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon. Good morning yet. It's good to see you.
Good to see you again, sir.
I, too, am a maniac for the rule of law. As you're aware, most of my adult career was in law enforcement, and I still consider myself a law enforcement guy. My family has been in law enforcement for a long time as well, so I appreciate your comments concerning oversight and the rule of law, and that's needed very much today, I think even more so today. But I do want to emphasize the fact that I've worked with all agencies, state, local, and federal, and 99.9% of our agents out there are top-notch. And I trust them watching my back at any time. But with that, you have very effectively answered 2 questions that I had that I was going to ask you. So as a result, I will yield back the remainder of my time, and best of luck.
Great to see you, Mr. Marino.
And I thank the gentleman. We now recognize Ms. Bass for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director, for coming and testifying today. I'd like to talk about the recent Operation Cross Traffic, FBI's nationwide effort to crack down on child sex trafficking. The FBI's October 13 release about the operation states, Operation Cross Country, a nationwide law enforcement action that focused on underage victims of prostitution, has concluded with the recovery of 149 sexually exploited children and the arrest of more than 150 pimps and other individuals. And first of all, I'd like to commend the agency for correctly referring to the children as sexually exploited children versus prostitutes, because a child who's under the age of consent should never be considered a prostitute. This release refers to other individuals, and I was wondering who those other individuals were. I have a concern that while it's extremely appropriate to focus on the pimps, it's also, in my opinion, very much appropriate to focus on the child molesters, who some people would call Johns. But I would like to know if that's who you were referring to, and what is the focus on the child molesters.
Yes, Congresswoman, that is what I understand was meant by that. There were more than 100 so-called Johns arrested as part of Operation Cross Country, along with the pimps and the children being exploited.
Thank you. The release also says that the children were recovered, and I wondered, what does that mean? So what has happened or will happen with the children?
As part of Operation Cross Country, the folks I call the angels of the FBI, which are victim specialists, are deeply involved in the operation to make sure that those kids get either reunited with their families or so many of them come from foster care.
Right.
If they get in a new placement, a healthier placement, a lot of them need medical attention right away. And that's what that's meant by that, to get that child to a place where they're cared for, either by their biological family or a placement in a foster family.
And in addition to medical attention, they certainly need a tremendous amount of therapy. I think it's important, you know, in the future, I would appreciate it if you would lift up where you were saying that the other individuals were referring to the child molesters. I think it's really important that we focus, we call it correctly, and that we focus on that. In addition, I would also like to know if the FBI tracks the number of children that are in foster care. We know that a large percentage of these kids are in foster care, but there's not a lot of documentation. Do you have documentation that that could give us some numbers?
I think we do. I think our intelligence analysts who support an effort like this have done some good work on that front. I'm a foster parent, so they know it's a passion of mine.
I didn't know that.
And so I think we could equip you with at least some of our thinking on it as we do this work.
Great. Well, I would like to follow up with your office and get that data. I'd also like to commend you for your Innocence Lost Task Force, and I'd like to know if there's more that we can be doing to assist your efforts in innocence loss. I work with them in the Los Angeles area, and you know, you have been in the leadership of bringing different sectors of law enforcement together to understand this problem and address it.
Well, I appreciate your interest in it, and I will ask my staff to think about ways in which we might get more help. We appreciate the offer.
Okay, thank you, and I yield back my time.
And I thank the gentlewoman. We now recognize Mr. Labrador for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Director, it's great to have you here. I have heard from many of my constituents about the refugee program and its impact on Idaho. As refugee admissions are increasing, there's growing concern that bad actors are not being caught in the vetting process and are gaining admission alongside bona fide refugees living in fear. I'm actually an advocate of refugee programs. I think it's a good thing to have refugee programs. But there's a lot of misconceptions out there and a lot of real fear about the people that are coming into the United States. This Congress has an obligation to address those concerns and ensure that the process is working correctly and protecting our national security. Numerous times over the past year, including yesterday, both the FBI's Assistant Director for the Counterterrorism Division, Michael Steinbeck, and yourself have testified about the flaws and limitations in the vetting of Syrian refugees. On October 8th, you testified that you were concerned about certain gaps in the data available to the FBI, and yesterday you testified that the FBI can only query what has been previously collected, which is obvious. I know that you have addressed this issue before, and you've addressed it, I think, once here today. But can you please explain to this committee the security gaps that exist for purposes of conducting full and effective background checks on foreign nationals who claim to have fled the conflict zone of Syria and who are seeking to be resettled as refugees in the United States?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Labrador. We learned some good lessons from less than excellent screening of Iraqi refugees 8 years ago or so. And in fact, we learned that some folks we had let in were serious actors that we had to lock up after we figured out who they were. And so we have gotten much better as an intelligence community at joining our efforts and checking our databases in a way that gives us high confidence. If we have a record on somebody, it will surface. That's the good news. The bad news is, as we talked about earlier, with Iraqi refugees, we had an opportunity for many more encounters between folks in Iraq and our soldiers, for example. So we had a lot more data. We had fingerprints, iris scans, we had forensics of different kinds. The challenge we face with Syria is that we don't have that rich a set of data. So even though we've gotten better at querying what we have, we certainly will have less overall. And so, as I said to a question earlier, someone only alerts as a result of our searches if we have some record on them. That's the challenge we face with Syria.
So is it accurate to state that the lack of intelligence available on the ground in Syria is rendering our traditional database biographic and biometric checks obsolete?
I wouldn't agree obsolete, but I would say we have a less robust data set dramatically than we have with Iraq, so it will be different.
So the FBI has repeatedly contrasted the United States' ability to collect intelligence on the ground in Iraq with its ability to do so in Syria. What can the FBI do to adapt to improve security checks for refugees originating from failed states with no available intelligence?
Well, that's a hard one. What we can do, the FBI, is just make sure that whatever is available figures into our review. But the underlying problem is, how do you generate intelligence in failed states? And that's one I don't have a good answer for.
So are you currently working with the intelligence community to try to fix this problem?
Oh, certainly. Everyone in the intelligence community is focused on trying to mitigate this risk by querying well and also finding additional sources of information so we can check against it.
Recognizing that ISIS in Syria and that there is a risk that bad actors may attempt to take advantage of this administration's commitment to bring at least 10,000 Syrian refugees into the United States over the next year, can you estimate the manpower and resources that will need to be diverted from other investigative programs to address this threat?
I'm not able to do that sitting here.
How can I ensure my constituents that the people that may or come to Idaho are safe, that they're not terrorists, that the people in my community are going to be safe?
Well, on behalf of the FBI, what you can assure them is that we will work day and night to make sure that if there's information available about somebody, we have surfaced it and we have evaluated it.
And I understand that if there's information, but the problem is that we don't have the information on most of these people. Isn't that true?
Yeah, so I can't sit here and offer anybody an absolute assurance that there's no risk associated with this.
Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
And I thank the gentleman, and now recognize Ms. Delbonnay for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Comey, for being here and for your service. I know as acting AG, you demonstrated a commitment to the Fourth Amendment and protecting Americans' privacy despite enormous pressure to do otherwise. And you've mentioned in your original testimony and in other comments that the rule of law and the Fourth Amendment is the spine of the FBI, and so I appreciate that commitment. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the FBI's use of aircraft. The FBI deployed aircraft over Ferguson last year in response to requests from local law enforcement. Is that correct?
Yes.
Does the FBI respond to these types of requests frequently?
Quite well, thank goodness there aren't the kind of turmoil and pain in communities frequently, but sure, if local law enforcement asks for help in getting a look at a developing situation, we will offer that help. We've done it in Baltimore, we did it in Ferguson, as I recall.
And what criteria have to be met for the FBI to send aerial resources to assist local law enforcement, or who makes that decision?
It's made at a fairly high level in the FBI. I think at the Special Agent in Charge level at least, that is the commander of the field office, so it has to go up through a variety of checks before it can be approved.
And what are the criteria that you use to make that decision?
I think it has to be part of an open investigation of ours or part of an open assistance to law enforcement matter. So it has to, we can get you the particulars of our policy, but as you know, the Bureau has a policy for everything, so there's a series of steps that have to be walked through to make sure it's part of either an open case of ours or it's a legitimate open assistance to law enforcement matter.
Okay, thank you. I'd appreciate the information. Your staff also acknowledged that the FBI, quote, routinely uses aviation assets in support of predicated investigations targeting specific individuals and when requested and appropriate in support of state and local law enforcement, end quote. That's why is it so important to stress this distinction when it appears that it's kind of more generalized type of surveillance?
I'm sorry, the distinction?
The distinction that you have in this, the feedback from your staff that you use aviation assets in support of predicated investigations targeting specific individuals, when in these cases of local law enforcement, et cetera, it seems to be more generalized type of surveillance.
Oh, I see. Well, I think we're just trying to explain how we use it. We don't fly planes around America looking down trying to figure out if somebody might be doing something wrong. The overwhelming use of our aircraft is a pilot flies as part of an investigation to help us follow a spy, a terrorist, or a criminal. And then with local law enforcement, if there is tremendous turbulence in a community, it's useful to everybody, civilians and law enforcement, to have a view of what's going on. Where are the fires in this community? Where are people gathering? Where do people need help? And sometimes the best view of that is above rather than trying to look from a car on the street.
And do you feel that warrants are necessary when you're targeting specific individuals, especially when you have aircraft equipped with new technologies like high-resolution cameras?
I don't think so. I meant what I said about the Fourth Amendment. We're not collecting the content of anybody's communication or engaging anything besides following somebody when we do that investigation. So we do it, as I said, we've done it since the Wright brothers with planes, and we do it in cars, we do it on foot, and the law is pretty clear that you don't need a warrant for that kind of observation.
But now that there are technology changes, I think even the most recent court case, you know, Florida versus Riley was in 1989. There's been a lot of changes in technology, and so it's not just what you might see with the human eye anymore. So are there other types of technologies, and do you think warrant standards should be in place when you have other types of technologies that might be used on these aircraft?
I suppose if you were putting technology on an FBI aircraft that had Fourth Amendment implications, that is, that it was reaching someone's communications or looking within a dwelling or something like that, it would have Fourth Amendment implications. But that's not what we use the aircraft for.
So what led to the decision to seek court orders when aircraft are equipped with Stingray technology?
Right, whenever we use, I think we have one aircraft that we can put Stingray technology on it, that is cell site simulators. And I suppose we can mount it on others if we had a court order to do it. But that we've decided as a matter of policy, now the whole Department of Justice does this, that if we're going to be operating a cell site simulator, it has Fourth Amendment implications, so we will get a warrant for that. So whether that's on the ground or in an airplane, we treat it the same way.
You said you decided. Do you feel like that you're required by law to do that?
I think we made that move before there was even a divide among opinions in the courts. Some courts have said you need it for that, some not. We went nationwide with a requirement for warrants. There's been no national decision on that, no Supreme Court level decision on that, but we just think given that some courts are requiring it, we do it across the country.
Thank you. My time's expired.
I thank the
I yield
gentleman,
back.
and now recognize Mr. Buck for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Director Comey.
Morning.
Wanted to ask you, do you remember Mr. Cohen's questions about renaming the FBI headquarters building earlier?
Yes. Yep.
And I appreciate your response that we have to look at things through the lens of history. I wanted to ask you about a few other historical figures and see if there were any other FBI buildings named after some of these folks. Former Democrat Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia was a member of the KKK. He was a recruiter for the KKK, and he held leadership positions with the KKK. There are the state capitol in West Virginia is named after, in Charleston, West Virginia, is named after Senator Byrd. The United States Courthouse and Federal Building in Beckley, West Virginia, is named after Senator Byrd. The United States Courthouse and Federal Building in Charleston, West Virginia, is named after Senator Byrd. And the Federal Correctional Institution in Hazleton, West Virginia, is named after Senator Byrd. My question is, do you know of any FBI buildings named after Senator Byrd?
I don't know, and I don't know whether we have folks sitting in the courthouse. I just don't know sitting here.
Okay. Former Democrat President Woodrow Wilson resegregated the entire government, including the armed forces, held a showing of the movie Birth of a Nation at the White House, and went so far as to praise it in spite of calls by the NAACP to ban it. Birth of a Nation was subsequently used as a recruiting tool for the Ku Klux Klan. Likewise, there are a number of buildings around this country named after President Wilson. In fact, there is a bridge leading in and out of Washington, D.C. named after President Wilson. Do you know of any buildings that the FBI occupies or predominantly owns that are named after President Wilson?
I don't.
Former President Lyndon Baines Johnson was fond of using the N-word, used it in the White House, used it while he was Senate Majority Leader, and used it in many other public settings. Many federal buildings are named after him. Are there any FBI buildings named after President Johnson?
I don't know.
And lastly, President Truman wrote to his soon-to-be wife the following words: "I think one man is just as good as another, so long as he's not a N-word or a Chinaman." Again, many buildings named after President Truman. Just wondering, any FBI buildings named after President Truman?
I don't know, sir.
And last after last, Democrat Senator Richard Russell was also a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and there is a Senate building named after Senator Russell. I assume there are, at least to your knowledge, no FBI buildings named after Senator Russell.
I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know.
And my last statement, I guess, would be that perhaps Congress should clean up its own act in naming buildings before it asks the FBI to, without the lens of history, try to rename buildings. I yield back my time.
And I thank the gentleman, and now recognize Mr. Cellini for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Comey, for your service and for coming before the committee today and for sharing your valuable insights. And thank you also to the extraordinary men and women who serve the Bureau and help keep our country safe. And I think our entire nation owes them a debt of gratitude. Many of us expressed our sincere concern and condolences following the recent mass shooting in Roseburg, Oregon, where 9 innocent men and women lost their lives. Many of us have shared the same sentiments following tragically similar events in Lafayette, Aurora, Newtown, and Blacksburg. But as more Americans lose their lives to senseless gun violence, this Congress has failed to act. And Director Comey, with this in mind, I'd like to draw on your experience to help us find solutions to this growing epidemic and to help us find the guts to take necessary action. And so first, I want to just draw your attention to the shooting which occurred at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Following the shooting, you ordered the FBI to conduct an internal review of policies and procedures surrounding background checks for weapons purchases. So my first question is, did that review occur, and what were the findings of that review?
Yeah. Thank you, Congressman. The review did occur. I asked my folks to do a 30-day examination, and 2 things came out of that. First, to confirm the facts as I understood them. There were no new facts with respect to Dylan Roof's purchase in particular that changed. And then it highlighted 2 potential areas for improvement, one internal to the FBI, one external. Internal, it highlighted for us that maybe we can surge resources and technology to try and reduce the number of gun sales that are held in the delayed pending status longer than 3 days. And so that work is underway. And then secondly, to get better and more timely records from state and local law enforcement about the disposition of people's arrests so that our examiners have good records to make a judgment on. And those conversations are ongoing.
So those are actually the 2 areas I'd like to discuss. As you well know, the current law requires that if a request to purchase a firearm is made, a background check is initiated, the FBI has 3 days to respond. If no response is provided, then the gun dealer is able to sell the weapon. My understanding is the FBI continues the review anyway, even if it's beyond the 3 days. That information is then conveyed to the gun dealer, and if that person is disqualified from buying a gun, what does the FBI do? So you now know a sale has occurred, or do you know a sale has occurred, and do you take action?
Yes. If after the 3-day window the gun's transferred and then the examiners discover the disqualifying information, my recollection is, and if I'm wrong we'll fix this, a notice is sent both to local law enforcement in that jurisdiction and to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms so that they can retrieve the firearm from the prohibited person.
So I would like to work with you on that because I'm not sure that that is actually the practice. I think the notice may go to ATF, but I don't believe it goes to the gun dealer or to local law enforcement. And I think that's a way that we can try to keep guns out of the hands of people who don't have them, and I'd very much like to work with you on that. The second issue is how do we incentivize, require, encourage local law enforcement to actually use the NICS system, because that background check system is only as good as the information that's in it. Have you done an analysis of what states participate, where the deficiencies are, or things we could do or the Congress can do to help ensure that more states are providing that disqualifying information, so at the bare minimum we're keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them under law.
Yeah, the mass murder in Charleston was an event that I think caused a lot of folks in local law enforcement, state law enforcement, to focus on this question. And as I said, there's a whole lot of conversation going on, and we are pushing out training to state and local law enforcement to explain to them what we need and why we need it in a timely fashion. I don't have, as I sit here, suggestions for how Congress might help us incentivize that cooperation. I think they're good people, and when they see the pain of a situation like Dylan Roof's, they want to be better. But I will get back to you if I have ideas for how Congress can help.
Because as you well know, Director, we can't require participation with the NICS system as a result of a Supreme Court decision, but we ought to be able to do things to create serious incentives or maybe penalties for states that fail to furnish that information, because as a result of that information not being in the NICS system, people are walking into gun stores and buying guns who would be otherwise disqualified if that information were known. So I look forward to working with you on that. I think it's should be an urgent national priority, and I thank you for the work that you're doing. I yield back.
Now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director, for being here, and I appreciated my father, as well as some of the others. My father was a Georgia State Trooper for all his life, 30-plus years, so I appreciate your commitment to law enforcement and being a part. I do have just some quick questions that I wanted to go back on. One has to do with an advisory that was put on October 8th. We're dealing with credit cards and the chip issue here. That was for consumer fraud, stated that new credit cards equipped with the microchip security technology are still vulnerable to identity theft, and that the use of PIN authentication in addition to a chip would be a more secure way to consumer transaction, be more simple signature verification. However, within 24 hours, that advisory was taken down, and a few days later issued advisory that no longer included the PINs. Now, it's my understanding Canada, Australia, many other countries have encouraged the PIN authorization because it is, frankly, has a lower fraud rate. My question would be, is in light of that, does the FBI consider PIN as a more secure form of authentication over signature verification?
I think the experts of the FBI would say that PIN and chip is more secure than PIN and signature. And the confusion there was our folks put out that public service announcement, and it was a miss on our part without focusing on the fact that most merchants in the United States don't have the capability to accommodate the PIN and chip. And so the worry was that's going to cause a whole lot of confusion when people start saying, where's the PIN and chip, when our equipment is set up in this country for PIN and signature.
Okay, well, let's talk about that a second, because many of the places that I go to, you either swipe, they're older cars, you just swipe, like on a gas station, or you go into, I used to own a store, we had a swipe machine. Any of them that now have and many of those, even with a swipe machine, have a number for debit cards, which is already there for the PIN. I know now I've just broken into using the chip because my new cars have chips, so I slide them in. I'm still learning how to do this. But the keypad is right there above it. I'm not sure I follow your answer there that the technology is not available. If the keypad is right there to input a chip, input a number, why is the technology not available?
Yeah, I don't know, and I'm not the world's smartest person on this, but what I've been told by my folks is it is available in some places, but it's not widely available in the United States. And if I'm wrong about that, we'll correct that. But
I'm just going on my own personal. And look, my Doug calling me going to the store, putting my card in. I've rarely found one that is just pure swipe with no keypad. I think, and I was just concerned, and if that's not right, and if you want to go back and look into that, I think the concern came among many that maybe there's also an issue because as a business owner myself, I paid different fees depending on how I did it. Like if a consumer used a credit card or versus a debit card. And I'm just wondering, could that have been an issue because using the PIN typically is a different fee? Was that possibly taken into account as the reason for the removal of this and change to say, well, it's not as worrisome as we first thought?
no, I think that could be the reason that if I'm right, that the equipment is not widely available in the United States, that people don't have an economic incentive to change. But that was not a factor in why we withdrew the public service announcement. My understanding is we withdrew it because our worry was we're going to confuse a whole lot of people who are going to roll into places saying, where's the chip and PIN? And it isn't widely available. That's, as I understand it, that was the concern.
Well, it is, and it's like everything. There was a lot of times when before debit card. I mean, again, I think the concern here is we deal in information security and everything else. Is you're always trying to move toward the more secure atmosphere. That's my only concern. And by moving back on that, it seemed like, at least in my opinion, that we're saying, okay, there is a better way, but we're not going to encourage that. We're just going to let the status quo, so we're saying. So just a question. I do have a question. We hit ECPA earlier, the email privacy, which I have a great interest in. One was said is basically the 180-day distinction in current law is something that we've talked about. You said that you use a warrant in all cases. It doesn't matter. Would you say that 30, and there's been statements, 30 prosecutors, former judges all say that requiring law enforcement to obtain a warrant from a court does not prevent law enforcement from doing its job? Would you agree with that, especially in light of this issue?
Yeah, I think by and large that's true. I think it poses unique challenges for our colleagues at the SEC, for example, investigating corporate fraud. But I think by and large for law enforcement, judges are available, and if we have the evidence, we can make the showing. So I think at a general level, sure.
But in a general level, and also from your, high standards is the FBI. I've always considered high standards. Even the FCC, some of these agencies that are wanted, whether they use it or not, they like it or not. I think from a law enforcement standpoint, from a concern standpoint, from a warrant standpoint, this is something that they could use, that they could go through normal means in investigation. I think that's the concern that many of us have. There's time for other questions. The hacking issues with OPM in China. Just a quick question. Have we, from the FBI's perspective, we actually trace that and say, yes, for a fact that we confirm that Chinese hackers stole this data on the OPM?
I have with high confidence an understanding of who did it. I'm not in a position to say it in an open forum.
Okay, and maybe we can get back on a different forum and discuss that, because like I said, that is a concern. We can't reward bad behavior, and I'm concerned that's what we're doing. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And I thank the gentleman and now recognize Mr. Jeffries for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Comey, for your presence here today and, of course, your great service to this country. I think you testified earlier today in your belief as to the efficacy of mandatory minimums. Is that correct?
Yes, I think I said they were a useful tool in my career as a prosecutor, especially in eliciting cooperation.
And can you just elaborate as to whether you still believe that mandatory minimums, in light of the explosion of the United States prison population, particularly relative to every other developed country in the world, is still a relevant law enforcement tool?
I think it is. Again, I'm not in a position by expertise, and I shouldn't in my job offer a view on whether it ought to be 10 years or 5 years, but I think the certainty of punishment is a useful tool in fighting crime. And in the absence of mandatory guidelines, that often comes in the form of a mandatory minimum. But that's about as far as I have the expertise and the position to go.
And is your view anchored in the fact that many prosecutors have articulated the position that in the absence of mandatory minimums, they don't have the same club by which to solicit cooperation and perhaps obtain plea bargains? Would that be part of your view here?
Yeah, in my experience, and comparing my experience with the state system, which did, again, in my experience as a prosecutor, did not have the tools to elicit cooperation that we did. But again, that's not a view on whether it ought to be this or it ought to be that. I don't have the expertise, or I'm not in a position to offer a view on that. But some certainty of punishment absent cooperation is very, very valuable in eliciting cooperation.
Now, there have been studies that have shown that in crimes that actually don't have mandatory minimums, the conviction rates at the federal level are actually higher than the conviction rates of those where mandatory minimums do exist. And so I think that's part of the reason why ideologically diverse group of individuals on both the left and the right, including the Heritage Foundation, which I believe said there's no evidence that mandatory minimums reduce crime, have questioned their continued need, at least in its current form. Now, can you comment on sort of the explosion of the United States prison population? When the war on drugs began in the early 1970s, we had less than 350,000 people who were incarcerated in America. Currently, that number is in excess of 2.3 million. As you know, we've got 5% of the world's population. 25% of the incarcerated individuals in the world are here in the United States of America. Many of us believe it creates a competitive disadvantage for us going forward, in addition to the damage that it does to the social fabric of many communities. Could you comment as to the mass incarceration phenomenon that exists in America and what, if anything, you think should be done about it from a public safety standpoint?
Sure. I struggle with the word mass incarceration because it conveys a sense that people were locked up en masse, when every case in some respect is a tragedy in my view, but everyone was individual, everyone had a lawyer, everyone had a judge, everyone had to be proven guilty. There's no doubt a whole lot of people were locked up, and that is a big problem for our country in one respect. But here's the fact. In 2014, America was far safer than it was when I was born in 1960, and I think a big part of that change, as a result of which a whole lot of people are alive today who wouldn't be, is due to law enforcement. And so I'm of a view that, yes, we can reform our criminal justice system. It can be better in a lot of ways, but we ought to reform it with an eye towards where we used to be and how we got from there to here, because I would not want to give back to our children, our grandchildren, the America that we lived in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. That's the reason I want us to be thoughtful about it. But I believe we can be better in a whole lot of ways that we probably don't have time to talk about.
Well, I certainly think it's important for us to be thoughtful. I grew up in New York City in the 1980s in the midst of the crack cocaine epidemic. 2,000 plus homicides in the city of New York alone were down under 350, and obviously no one wants to return to that. The Pew study, though, however, I believe concluded that in all 17 states that have cut their incarceration rates, they've experienced a decline in crime over the past decade. And so it seems to me that there's room empirically, based on the data, for a real discussion as to how to get the balance correct. I gather you share that view, and I just appreciate your willingness to continue in a dialogue for us to get the benefit of your views as we move forward toward criminal justice reform.
Thank you. Happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and I now recognize Mr.
Can I be recognized for a point of personal privilege?
Gentleman is recognized without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm a student of history, and when I make a mistake, I want to correct it. And I was wrong in saying that Senator Vandenberg's son had committed suicide. It was a Senator Hayes, and his son was arrested in Lafayette Park for being gay, but that was McCarthy who was after him. So I was right church, wrong pew, but I wanted to make it correct the record. Thank you, sir.
Thank the gentleman. I now recognize Mr. DeSantis for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Director Comey. I've noticed, I'm a former prosecutor, companies have begun notifying customers when law enforcement requests data through a subpoena or warrant unless there's a court-ordered non-disclosure requirement. And I think particularly for like child pornography investigations, this may be an issue. Do you think that that's something that could hamper investigations?
I do. It's something I've been hearing more and more about over my 2 years in this job from prosecutors who are worried about it.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to address that, so I'm glad to hear you say that. The President has a plan to bring over a lot of people from the civil war in Syria, tens of thousands, perhaps as many as 100,000. Can we vet them? And if not, isn't it just a fact that some of those people will be contributing to some of the homegrown terrorism that we have in this country?
We can, thank you for that question. It's a very important issue that we've talked about a little bit here today. We can vet them. We've gotten better at vetting and learned lessons from the vetting of Iraqi refugees. The challenge we face is we can only vet against data that's been collected with respect to a person, and so the information we had for Iraq was much richer than we'll have for Syria.
You can't call up the Damascus Police Department and get files, correct?
You got it.
So there's a problem here potentially, and I know it's going to fall on you then to have to defend, the American people once some of these individuals come into the country, and it's just something that I'm concerned with. There's been talk about the reforming sentencing. Is it your view, people will say that drug offenses are nonviolent offenses, but particularly when they get into the federal system where these are really significant trafficking offenses typically, is it accurate to say that they're nonviolent, or is the drug trade inherently violent in your judgment?
Well, I guess each case is different, but in my experience, anyone who's part of a trafficking organization is part of an organization that has violence all through it, and that whether you're a mill worker or a runner or a lookout or an enforcer, you're part of something that's suffocating a community. And so I have a hard time characterizing drug organizations in any respect as nonviolent.
And in terms of the drop in crime that you alluded to, is part of that simply because there have been stiffer sentences and so habitual criminals are incapacitated and they're off the streets, and therefore our communities are safer?
I believe that was a big part, and I think most experts believe it was a big part of the historic reduction we've seen in crime over my career.
With respect to individual offenses, I know there's been discussion about mishandling of classified information, 18 U.S.C. 1924. Just one, does the FBI keep records of all the investigations related to each offense of the criminal code?
Yeah, I don't know that it's searchable by each offense implicated by an investigation. Yeah, if a case was charged, then the charged offenses would be reflected in Sentinel. That's our record keeping, but I don't think every possible charge.
So in other words, we know every mishandling of classified information offense. We can look that up. That actually gets brought by the U.S. Attorney, but we don't know whether the U.S. Attorney declined X number of cases pertaining to that?
I think that's correct, but I also don't know with what clarity our records would reflect if there were a number of potential violations in a case, whether it would be clear from our case files that it was that.
Understood. In terms of handling classified information, there's been just stuff in the press about, well, you know, something needs to be marked classified. And is your understanding of the U.S. code that if I were to send classified information over an unsecure system, the fact that it was not marked classified, does that mean that I have not committed the offense?
That one, as I did with Chairman Goodlatte, I think I'd prefer not to answer. I'm trying to make sure that, given that we have a matter under investigation now that relates in part to that topic, that I preserve our ability to be seen and to be in reality honest, independent, and competent. And if I start commenting on things that might touch it, I worry that I could jeopardize that.
How would that, and I think that's an admirable posture, and I think it's one you've shown throughout your career. How does, when the President of the United States renders a judgment about a specific case saying that there's no, for example, national security damage if certain information has been disclosed, how does that help the investigation or does it hurt the investigation?
The FBI is the three things I said earlier: honest, competent, and independent. We follow the facts, only the facts. All we care about are the facts.
Well, I hope that that's, I have no doubt that that will be how you conduct yourself. I just hope that as you guys do your work, as it moves on to other aspects of our system, that it's based on the merits of the case in every instance, and it's not based on political edicts from on high. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it. I yield back.
And I thank the gentleman and now recognize Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and to Director, thank you so very much. You appeared yesterday in front of the Homeland Security Committee and added a great deal of insight. And so I'd like to not pursue a line of questioning, but hope to have an opportunity to meet with you on something we began discussing yesterday, which is cybersecurity and the whole role that it plays as really, I'd almost call it another figure, if you will, another entity in this scheme of terrorism. I am the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, Homeland Security Investigations, and with my ranking member and chairman, we're looking to be responsible in addressing, which I believe, issues in the criminal justice system and somewhat overlapping the question of terrorism in this committee and certainly in Homeland Security. Let me just quickly start with a question that I think I introduced in the record yesterday, the no-fly for foreign fighters. And we heard testimony that indicated the numbers might be going down, and then I had a number in my notes that there was 250 approximately Americans who had left to the foreign fight and may be coming back. The thing that I would say to you is that we must always be prepared. 9/11, the scenario of 9/11 was one that we had never imagined before. We had never imagined an airplane being used as a torpedo. We imagined hijacking. We lived through that. We never imagined. So most time imagination comes with Disney World, but I know that this is a very serious posture. And so we want to just hopefully any extra tool that we can give you with respect to refining and defining the list that you have to make sure that we have every potential, not every potential, but every foreign fighter. Would that be helpful to you?
Yes, we want to make sure the list is comprehensive. If we could get every foreign fighter on there, that would be great.
So if we have this legislation, which is to add extra tools to you to ensure that list is a vetted and a well-updated list. Would that be helpful?
I don't know the legislation, but the goal I share is to have a complete, updated, carefully vetted list.
I appreciate that very much. Let me move now to guns. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I imagine, and let me say that I served as a municipal court judge. I would see officers all the time, particularly see them undercover. And with a little smile on my face, I'd have to say, who are you? Because obviously dealing with some of the matters in local government, they were in some tough places and had to look that way as well. And I recognize the dangers that our officers face. We had a horrific tragedy in our community in Houston, but we just recently lost an officer again in New York, and we lose officers, as we do with others who are impacted by guns. The 11-year-old who is a child who shot an 8-year-old over a dog, and another youngster, 3 years old, that had a gun, I believe, over this weekend and found it. We never can, again, imagine the ability of our children. I ask you the question, why law enforcement is not our biggest champion, not on gun control. I call it gun safety regulation, not on diminishing the Second Amendment, but I call it responsibly handling weapons. Who would want to lose a 4-year-old in a drive-by shooting in New Mexico because someone had a gun? And so, can you answer? We've introduced legislation, and you might want to comment on this in particular, that gives you an extended period of time on this gun check situation, which was one of the horrible situations in the South Carolina 9, where you were doing your work, or the system was doing its work, but since you weren't heard from, they just allowed this gentleman to get a gun and kill 9 people. But can you answer? We have a number of legislative initiatives. The members of Congress don't want anything to do with taking away your gun, or controlling. They want to regulate the safety infrastructure. I've introduced legislation to keep guns away from children. Mr. Director, in your dealing with law enforcement, the impact that guns have on this, more guns in the United States than people, the impact on the work that you all do. Would you answer that for me, please? And my last thing before you go, there have been a number of church fires. We keep ignoring it. There's a series that's just happened. We had another series before. Would you comment on the FBI's work that they're doing? And if the chairman would just indulge me, I'll just throw another question there. I appreciate it. If you take this name down, Robbie Tolan, T-O-L-A-N, who was killed on his front porch. It wasn't a porch, it was a cement driveway of his home. Excuse me, let me stand corrected. Let me apologize to his mother. He was wounded and still lives with the bullet in his liver. And the disappointing aspect is that it was an officer who mistook him as an African-American male as in a stolen car. He was in his mother's car, going home to his house in Houston, Texas, in a small city called Bel Air. And my question is, for you to look into what further FBI investigation can go into this case. And I would greatly appreciate it if, Mr. Chairman, you would allow him to answer that. I thank you for your indulgence.
Gentleman's welcome to answer his question.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson-Lee. I will certainly look into it. The last matter with respect to church fires, we have not ignored them. Our agents investigating a number of church fire incidents around the country. We have not found patterns and connections that connect to our civil rights enforcement work, but we are continuing to work on it. With respect to guns, the people in the FBI care deeply about trying to stop gun violence. What the Bureau does not do is get involved in the public policy legal questions, because our job is to enforce the law. We leave it to the Department of Justice to make recommendations as to what the law should be. I think that's a place it makes sense for us to be, but we are passionate about trying to enforce the law against bad guys with guns of all kinds, especially in our cities, where gun violence, especially gang-related gun violence, is increasingly a plague this year.
Well, the proliferation of guns endangers law enforcement across the nation, does it not?
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Well, he was just shaking his head saying yes.
Saying guns in the hands of criminals endanger all of us, including law enforcement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think all of us would agree with that. Director Comey, I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions, and I want to thank you for being here. Many people here in the committee have recognized your unbiased attitude towards enforcing the law as it's written, and I think that speaks very highly of you, and I've been very impressed with the cogency and just the clarity of your testimony this morning. I believe that commitment to independent enforcement of the law is a genuine and sincere conviction on your part. Director Comey, let me, the Department of Justice has investigated past allegations of possible violations, and I know you've touched on this subject before, so forgive me for sort of rehashing it. Possible violations of the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act. Indeed, in a letter dated August 4th, 2015, responding to this committee's request for an investigation of possible violations of the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act by Planned Parenthood, the Department of Justice stated that since, quote, since the inception of the Partial Birth Abortion Act, the department has investigated allegations at health facilities that are related to possible violations of that law. How many, I guess, is there any current investigation by the FBI related to Planned Parenthood on the and the footage that's been released by the Center for Medical Progress at this time that you know of?
As I said in response to the earlier question, I will get back to you and let you know. As I sit here now, I don't have a strong enough grasp of where that stands. I do know letters were sent to the Department of Justice, but I got to figure out exactly where we are, and I can get back to you.
Okay, but as far as you know, even apart from the Planned Parenthood videos, do you know of any partial birth abortion ban investigations or enforcement actions have been taken by the FBI?
I don't. I know we have jurisdiction to investigate such things. I believe we have, but I don't know enough to answer that well right here.
Well, I would appreciate that last part being included in any response you have. Obviously, there's some of us, you know, that think that the rule of law applies to these little ones that have so little ability to protect themselves as well. And let me shift gears on you. I know there's been several questions asked today about gun violence, and I assure you I agree with your last answer completely, that we want to do everything that we can to keep guns out of the hands of criminals, and that it's vital for the sake and safety of the public that we do that. There are those of us that would ask law enforcement, do we think that it be wise to take guns out of the hands of law enforcement? And almost no one would suggest that, because we believe, I do, that guns in the hands of properly trained FBI agents is a protection to the public. And from my perspective, that would suggest that it's not the guns, it's whose hands they're in. Because it's hard to make a case that if they're, on the one hand, a protective measure in the hands of police officers, that they're something that can protect and deter and prevent or interdict violence, that they're a good thing, and that all of us from almost every spectrum of political consideration would suggest that, then the obvious reasoned response becomes that it is indeed not the guns, but whose hands they're in. So my question to you is, how do we separate the argument so that we are doing everything that we can to prevent those who have lost their Second Amendment rights, who have demonstrated violence towards society or some issue with mental illness? How do we deal with that while still leaving intact the right to own and bear arms under the Second Amendment by those who follow the law and indeed oftentimes protect themselves and sometimes even protect officers of the law?
I think, Congressman, that's a question for others, including Congress. The FBI's role is such that I think it's very important that that not be a conversation, debate that we participate in, because we don't make policy for the American people. The American people tell us what they think the law should be, how to solve these hard problems, and then we will enforce the law. I think that's critical to us remaining, those three things I said, honest, competent, and independent. And so, honestly, it's just not a conversation I think the FBI should participate in professionally.
Well, that's a very reasonable answer. I hope that we can do that. I think it will make your job easier, and it will augment the great work you do for the country. And with that, I'm going to end my question time. Is there, we have any yes, we do. I think that Mr. Bishop is not here. No, so, oh, I'm sorry. The gentleman, Mr. Bishop, you're recognized for 5 minutes. He flying under radar there.
Yeah, I did. I flew under the radar. Director, I was here earlier. I apologize for stepping out. I want to begin by thanking you for what you and your entire team does, because what you do on a daily basis is something that most of us don't even know about. We can't comprehend, and you keep us safe, and we're grateful for what you do. And on behalf of my family, my constituents, my state, my nation, I'm very grateful to you and your entire department. So wanted to tell you that, and I admire your testimony today, and thank you for your candor. You've been here forever, taking a lot of questions. I thought maybe I'd ask you about Syrian refugees and what we're seeing. My state of Michigan is a huge hub for those of Middle Eastern descent. There is some concern about the onslaught of refugees into our country, and I apologize if you've answered this question, but I'd like to ask you, what do we know? How do we vet these refugees coming to our country? Is there a way to do it that we can rely upon? My office does a lot of immigration work. We work with those who are attempting to immigrate legally every day, and we help them any way we can to try and jump through the hoops. It's very strange that we now have groups that are coming in the way they are, that really skip all those steps in between. So I'm just wondering if you could share with me what your experience is and what you know about the process.
Yeah, it's a process I describe as good news and bad news. The good news is we have gotten, as a country, an intelligence community in particular, much better at organizing ourselves so that we get a complete picture of what we know about somebody. We learned some lessons from Iraqi refugees 8 years ago or so, and so we've gotten better at querying our holdings. And so if there's a ripple this person has created in our pond, I'm confident that we will see it and be able to evaluate it. The bad news is we will have less data with respect to folks coming out of Syria than we did with respect to Iraq, because we don't have the U.S. Army presence and all of that would give us biometrics to query. So the risk is that someone who is a blank slate to us will be vetted by us in a process that's efficient and complete, but will show no sign of anything because they've never crossed our radar screen. That's why I describe it as a process that's gotten a lot better, but that we can't tell you is risk-free.
And as time goes on, the process that you are going through will be more apparent to the American people. I say that because there are a lot of folks in my state who are very concerned, and that level of unknown, of not understanding exactly the process, has caused a little panic across the district. And the more that we can hear, the more we understand what the process is. We remember the Iraqi refugees in the state of Michigan, especially in my area in southeast Michigan. So appreciate your ongoing communication on how that's going. I want to switch gears with you real quick. I've had the pleasure of visiting and working with a number of youth-serving organizations in my district, and I know at least one of those organizations is here today represented. It's important work that they do in the community. And I've spoken to some of them about the importance of keeping their kids safe, and one of the ways they do that is getting background checks, and it ensures so many different ways of fostering a safe environment. And it's really an issue I feel very deeply about. I have kids of my own. Can you talk a little bit about the value of including national FBI fingerprint background checks as a part of the comprehensive screening of staff and volunteers? There are so many that are right there with our children, and we know that the FBI background checks is the gold standard of the process. Can you share a little bit about how we can promote that and encourage that?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. And I think if I remember correctly, we've actually been doing a pilot program on that topic at our criminal justice information systems operation, which I do believe is the gold standard. You're right. So anybody who wants to ensure that people in contact with children or in any other sensitive position have been checked out, the best way to do it is working with us so we can query our holdings. And there's an exciting new feature that's coming on now as part of our next generation identification. We're building in something called wrap-back, which means if you query somebody as a daycare provider, if they are ever again arrested, you will get notified, because that's been a hole in the system. People are clean when they first go in, then they get in trouble 5 years down the road, and you never tell the daycare about this. So wrap-back will make a big difference and make the gold standard platinum in a way. So I very much agree with your sentiment on that topic.
Did you say wrap back or
Wrap-back, R-A-P-B-A-C-K. So if someone develops a rap sheet, we get back to
Gotcha. All right, that's the connotation. Okay. Sir, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate all your testimony today. And with that, I yield back.
And I thank the gentleman. My apologies for missing him the first time. And I now recognize Mr. Ratcliffe for 5 minutes. It's a tough day here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Comey, thanks for being here. It's good to see you a second day in a row.
Yes, sir.
I want to ask you a couple cybersecurity issues. Before I do that, I did want to follow up from a question I asked you about your at the Homeland Security Committee yesterday. We had a brief exchange about the president's decision to take in 10,000 Syrian refugees over the next year, and as we talked about, that's a 500 or 600% increase over prior years. And I had indicated to you that humanitarian concerns aside, I was troubled with respect to national security, the national security aspects of it, as you're hearing from many of my colleagues here, particularly because ISIS has said that it would use or would try to use the refugee process to get into the United States. And further to that point, as you've testified, our own databases don't have information on some of these individuals, so there are gaps of intelligence there. So we had a discussion about that figure of 10,000 yesterday. I guess if you had been the sole decider on that issue, what figure would you have recommended to the president?
I don't know, and I'm pleased to say it's not my job to recommend that to the president. I just don't know.
Well, I understand that. I know the FBI is not a policy making body with respect to that issue, but as you recall, we had a discussion. I asked Secretary Johnson the same thing, and he assured me that there was an interagency process. But I guess what I'm trying to get at was, is this a figure that the administration presented to you, or and said, you know, meet the security obligations that come with this, or was this part of a process where there was actually input from folks like you that should be providing input on what that number would be?
I think there was plenty of input from the FBI and other parts of the intelligence community on sort of how we thought about the good news and the bad news. I don't know and don't recall, and don't know if I could say, even if I did recall, how a number came up. It wouldn't have come from the FBI, but I just don't know.
Okay. Well, you understand the concern that we would hope that these decisions were driven by intelligence rather than political reasons or pressure from our European allies or other folks around the world. And so that's why I asked the question. But turning to cybersecurity, and I chair the subcommittee on cyber at Homeland, and you know, your written testimony, you said, I want to make sure I get this right, an element of virtually every national security threat and crime problem the FBI faces is cyber-based or facilitated. And I want that to sink in for everyone, because it's such an important point for us to consider in our oversight of the FBI. I think it really speaks to the gravity of the issue here, that you're seeing a cyber element to almost every national security threat and crime problem. So aside from the encryption issue, which I've heard you, I've had the opportunity to hear you talk about in the past, what are the major challenges that you face in detecting and prosecuting cybercrime right now at the FBI?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for your interest in that issue and your leadership there. Two big issues are getting the right folks and the right equipment. In reverse order, the bad guys have very sophisticated equipment, And so if we're going to be good at responding to all the threats we're responsible for, we got to make sure we have world-class systems. And then we got to have great people to operate them, and that's a challenge when we're facing a cybersecurity industry that will pay young folks a lot of dough to go work in the private sector. We compete on mission. I tell these people, you're not going to make much of a living, you're going to make a great life. I hope that convinces their families as well, but those are the two big focuses for us.
Terrific. Thank you, Director. So the issue of insider threats has been described by at least some as the greatest threat to businesses that operate in cyberspace. And of course, we all saw the scale of that threat with respect to Edward Snowden. I know that the Department of Justice has asked Congress for clarity on the law in this area for assistance in prosecuting insiders who access sensitive data that they're not authorized to. And I want to give you an opportunity to elaborate on that from your perspective.
It's an important part of the threat. That's absolutely true. I don't know what the department's questions and concerns are about their legislative authorities on that front, so I don't think I can offer anything useful there.
Okay. Well, good. Well, my time's expired, but like everyone else, I want to express my thanks. Of course, I had the opportunity to work for you, both as when you were the acting Attorney General and as the Deputy Attorney General, and because of that, I have great confidence in you, and I am grateful for your continued service, and am comforted by the fact that you're in the Director's chair and that you're the person making such important decisions about our nation's security. So thank you, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you.
Well, I would just take the moment to echo those comments. With 7-year-old children, we're grateful that people like you are on the job. This would conclude today's hearing. Thanks to our distinguished witness for attending. Thank the audience here. Grateful all of you for being here. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. And with that, thank you again, Director Comey. This hearing is adjourned.